She was the kind of woman people looked through, not at. Mara Calloway had lived in Red Hollow long enough to know exactly what the town thought of her. Too wide, too quiet, too much. They smiled at her pastries and sneered at everything else. But on one ordinary Tuesday at the market, a 5-year-old girl who hadn't eaten in 3 weeks reached out and took a cookie from Mara's hand, and the whole world held its breath. That child's father had tried everything, the town had tried nothing, and Mara, the woman they all laughed at, was the only one who got down on her knees. If you've ever been underestimated by the people around you, stay until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The market on Tuesdays smelled like sawdust and fried dough and the particular sourness of too many people packed into too little shade. Red Hollow wasn't much of a town. 3 dusty streets, a church with a cracked bell that only rang halfway, a general store that never had quite what you needed. But Tuesday market was the one day the whole valley came together, and on that day, it felt almost like something. Mara Calloway set up her table the same way she always did. Checked the cloth twice to make sure it lay flat. Arranged the pastries in rows, the butter cookies up front, the dark rye loaves to the left, the little jam tart she'd been making since she was 12 in a neat cluster at the center. She had a wooden sign her late husband Thomas had carved before his cough took him. Calloway's. Just that. No flowery words, no fancy paint. Thomas had said the pastries would speak for themselves, and for a while, back when Thomas was alive and she was just a baker's wife, and not yet the subject of anyone's particular cruelty, she'd believed him. That was 4 years ago. Now she set up the table and kept her eyes down and waited. The first person to walk by that morning was Clara Hennessy, who ran the dry goods counter at her husband's store and had the kind of sharp little face that seemed permanently arranged around a judgment. Clara looked at the table, looked at Mara, made a small sound like she'd bitten into something unpleasant. "You're blocking the walkway again," Clara said. The table was exactly where it always was, not an inch wider than any other stall. "Morning, Clara," Mara said. Clara sniffed and walked on. That was how it usually went. Some days were worse. Some days, a couple of the younger women would stop nearby and talk about her as if she weren't standing 3 feet away. "Have you seen how much butter she uses? No wonder she looks like she does. I feel sorry for her, really, don't you? Well, I might if she weren't so." And Mara would keep her hands busy rearranging things that didn't need rearranging, and she'd breathe through her nose until the tightness in her chest loosened enough to keep going. She was 34 years old. She had a small house at the edge of town with a kitchen that was too big for one person and a garden that she kept, so the work would give her hands somewhere to be. She sold pastries on Tuesdays and sometimes on Fridays if she'd had a good week. She was not beautiful by the town's accounting, being broad-shouldered and full-figured, with flour perpetually worked into the creases of her palms and brown hair that did whatever it wanted regardless of what she tried. She laughed too loud when something was genuinely funny, which embarrassed people who preferred their amusement kept at a more dignified register. She was, by Red Hollow's estimation, a source of mild entertainment and occasional pity, and nothing more. By 10 in the morning, she'd sold half the rye loaves and most of the tarts, and was refilling her display from the basket under the table when she heard the noise. It wasn't loud, exactly. It was the kind of noise a crowd makes when it shifts from ignoring something to watching it, a collective realigning of attention, a tightening. Mara straightened up and looked. 20 feet away, near the water trough at the edge of the market square, a man was crouched down in front of a small girl. He was big, the kind of big that came from actual work, not just size, with the weathered hands and the sun-dark neck of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. His hat was off, held against his chest, and he was talking to the girl in a low, urgent voice, and the girl was looking at the ground. The girl was tiny, maybe 5, maybe just turned 6. Brown braids, a dress that had been washed so many times the pattern had faded to almost nothing. She was standing very still in the way that children sometimes stand when they've learned that stillness is safer than moving, and she was not looking at the man, and she was not looking at the food in his hands. He was holding a piece of bread, just a plain piece of bread torn from a loaf he'd clearly bought moments before. He was holding it out to her with the careful, deliberate patience of someone who'd been doing this for a long time and was running out of the thing that made patience possible. "Just a bite?" he said. His voice carried just far enough for Mara to catch it. "Lena, please," Just one. The girl, Lena, said nothing. She didn't shake her head. She didn't reach for it. She just stood there, and Mara could see from the line of the child's shoulders that she wasn't being stubborn. She was somewhere else, somewhere the bread couldn't reach. Around them, the market kept going. People glanced over, assessed, moved on. A woman near Mara muttered something to her companion about some people not being able to handle their own children. Someone laughed. A man leading a mule around the far end of the square gave the father and daughter a wide berth as if grief might be contagious. Mara looked at the little girl's face. Then she reached under her table, unwrapped one of the butter cookies she kept separate from the display. The ones she made smaller and rounder than the ones she sold, the test batch, the ones she ate herself. And she walked over. She didn't think about it particularly. She wasn't making a decision, not in the way that decisions feel like anything. She just walked over. She didn't approach the man. She went around him, came to the girl's side, and then she did something she almost never did in public. She got down. All the way down, onto one knee, in the market square dust, with her good skirt in her flower-pale hands, and she brought herself level with the child's face. "Hey," Mara said. Lena's eyes flicked sideways. Not fully toward her, but enough. "I made too many of these this morning," Mara said. Not loud. Conversational, like she was just talking to herself and the child happened to be nearby. "I always do on Tuesdays. Can't seem to stop my hands once they get going." She held out the cookie, small and round and golden-edged. "You'd be doing me a favor, really." Silence. The man, the father, had gone completely still. Mara could feel him watching from above her, could feel the quality of his held breath, but she didn't look at him. "No rush," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." She waited. The market moved around them. 30 seconds. A minute. Long enough that a couple of people had slowed down to stare, and Mara could feel that too, the weight of being looked at. But she kept her eyes on the child and her arms steady and her face easy. Then Lena reached out and took the cookie. She didn't eat it right away. She held it in both hands and looked at it, and her small brow furrowed like she was trying to remember something or maybe trying to decide something, and then very slowly she took a bite. The marketplace went quiet. Or maybe it didn't. Maybe the carts kept creaking and the chickens kept complaining and the usual Tuesday noise kept right on going. But in the particular square of world where Mara was kneeling in the dust, it felt quiet. It felt like something stopping and something else starting. "Good?" Mara asked. Lena looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. Her eyes were dark and very serious and fringed with thick lashes, and they were exactly the eyes of a child who had been sad for much longer than children were built to be sad. "It's sweet," Lena said. Her voice was small and rusty from disuse. "Butter and a little brown sugar," Mara said. "My mother's recipe. She made them for me when I was about your size." She paused. She always said the secret was not rushing them. Let them go slow in the oven. Patience makes them better. Lena looked down at the cookie again. She took another bite. Mara got to her feet. Her knee ached. It always ached. Had since she'd slipped on the ice 3 winters back and never quite healed right. And she was aware that she was dusty and probably had a mark on her skirt now, but she found she didn't care particularly. The man was staring at her. She looked at him for the first time. He was younger than she'd expected, close up. Early 40s, maybe, though the last year or so had clearly taken something from him. He had the particular hollowness around the eyes of someone who hadn't slept right in months, and his jaw was set in the rigid way of men who'd decided that holding themselves together was the only thing standing between them and collapse. His hat was still off, still pressed to his chest, and he was looking at Mara like she had done something that violated his understanding of how things worked. "Elias Boone," he said. His voice came out rougher than he probably intended. "Mara Calloway. How did you—" He stopped, looked at his daughter, who was finishing the cookie in small, careful bites, her eyes aimed somewhere in the middle distance. "She hasn't eaten more than a few spoonfuls in 3 weeks. I've had the doctor out twice. I've tried—" He pressed his lips together. "I've tried everything anyone could think of." "She's grieving," Mara said, quietly enough that only he could hear. Something moved across his face. "Her mother passed 4 months back. Fever. I know, Mara said. She didn't know the details. Red Hollow was small enough that you heard things, but she'd been at the edges of this particular story, never close enough to it. But she knew grief well enough to recognize it in a child's body, the way it lived in the posture, the way it made eating feel like a betrayal. Elias looked at her for a long moment. There was something working in him. She could see it, something that a proud man was fighting against and losing. Miss Calloway, he said carefully, would you consider— He stopped again, started over. I have a ranch, about 6 miles out. It's just me and Lena and old Pete, who works the horses, and a woman who comes in twice a week to clean. Lena doesn't eat. She barely talks. She's gotten worse every week, and His voice cracked on the last word. He stopped, swallowed hard. I don't know what I'm doing wrong. You're not doing anything wrong, Mara said. Then why? Because it's not about doing, not yet. She looked at Lena again, who had finished the cookie and was now standing quietly with her hands folded, watching them with that serious, too-old gaze. She's not refusing food because of anything you've done. She's refusing it because eating means she's still here, and she's not sure she wants to be. The words landed hard. She watched Elias absorb them, watched his throat move. Would you come? He asked. I can pay. Fair wage. He glanced at his daughter, and in that glance was everything. Every night he'd stood outside her door listening for her breathing, every meal she'd left untouched, every moment he'd sat across from her and not known how to reach through to whatever was left of her. I just need someone who knows how to do what you just did. Mara looked at Lena. Lena was looking back at her, still serious, still a little rusty around the edges, but watching. I'll come out tomorrow, Mara said. We'll see how she does. She went home that afternoon and sat at her kitchen table for a long time before she moved. The house was the same as always, the dried herbs hanging in the window, the cracked blue pitcher on the shelf Thomas had meant to replace, the particular silence of a space designed for more people than currently occupied it. She had 34 years of practice being alone in it, and most days that was fine. Most days the kitchen was company enough, the bread rising, the oven ticking with heat. Today it felt emptier than usual. She thought about Lena, the way the child had held the cookie in both hands like it might disappear, the way she'd said it's sweet in that voice that sounded like she hadn't expected anything to be sweet anymore. Mara had been married for 7 years to Thomas Calloway, who had been a good and decent man, and when he died she had grieved in the ordinary way, badly, for a long time, and then less badly, and then in the way that becomes part of you rather than all of you. She had not had children. It was something they'd wanted and not gotten, and then Thomas was gone, and it became one of the many things she'd put away in a back room of herself and tried not to walk past too often. She wasn't sure what she was walking into. She packed a basket that evening. Butter. The good flour from the jar she kept for special occasions. Brown sugar. 2 vanilla beans she'd been saving. A crock of honey. She worked methodically the way she always worked, because the doing of things was the only way she knew to manage the feeling of things. Mem. She arrived the next morning to a house that looked like it was trying very hard not to fall apart. The Boone Ranch sat at the end of a long, unpromising track, with the mountains at its back and a dry creek running along one edge and fields that had gone to scrub at the corners. The house itself was solid enough, timber and stone, built to last, but it had the look of a place that had stopped being cared for and hadn't quite remembered how to start again. The kitchen garden was half-weeded. The porch railing had a section missing. A shutter on the upper window hung at an angle, and nobody had fixed it. Elias met her in the yard. He looked like he'd slept about as well as she'd expected. She's inside, he said. Had a bad night. Most of them bad lately? Most of them. He took the basket from her without asking, which she appreciated. I should tell you, she probably won't react to you the same way she did yesterday. Yesterday was— He seemed to search for the word. I don't know what that was. It was 1 cookie, Mara said. Don't make it more than that yet. He gave her a look that was equal parts hope and wariness. You always that direct? Generally. He almost smiled. Not quite. Inside the house was dim and smelled of wood smoke and something stale, Closed windows, maybe, or just rooms that hadn't had enough air moving through them. Mara noted it without comment. The kitchen was at the back, and it was large enough but bare, in a way that meant it had stopped being really used. There was a cold skillet on the stove, a loaf of bread in a cloth that had gone hard at the edges. Lena was sitting at the kitchen table. She was smaller somehow than she'd seemed at the market. Partly that was the setting. In the open square, she'd had space around her, but here, at this too big table, she looked very small and very still. She was looking at her hands. She didn't look up when Mara came in. Mara set her basket on the counter. She didn't say good morning, didn't say anything about yesterday or about eating or about how she was here to help. She just started unpacking her things. "You have a good mixing bowl?" she asked Elias, who'd followed her in. "Somewhere." "Find it." She looked around the kitchen. "And I need the oven going. It's cold in here." He went to work. There was something in the way he moved, efficient, relieved to be told what to do, that told her he was the kind of man who functioned better when there was a task, the kind of man who'd been drowning in things that couldn't be fixed and was grateful for something that could. Mara began to measure flour. She didn't talk to Lena directly. She talked. She always talked when she baked, a running quiet commentary on what she was doing and why, the way her mother had talked to her. But she aimed it at the counter, at the bowl, at no one in particular. "The trick with bread is you have to mean it," she said, working the flour into a mound on the clean board Elias had produced. "You can't rush it, and you can't be angry when you're making it. Bread knows." She made a well in the center. "My mother said you could always taste when someone was unhappy while they baked. The bread comes out mean, tough in all the wrong places." Silence from the table. Mara added the water, started working it in. "She was right, mostly," Mara continued. "I tested it a lot as a girl. Baked when I was furious once, after a big argument I won't bore you with, and the loaves came out so dense you could have built a wall with them." She paused, pressing the heels of her hands into the dough. "Baked the next day when I'd calmed down and they were perfect. Make of that what you will." She heard a very small sound from the table. Not quite a laugh, an exhale that might have been the precursor to one. She kept working, didn't look. That first week she learned the shape of things. Elias was up before dawn every day, out with the horses and the cattle and the 100 small crises a working ranch produced without pause. He had 2 hired hands who came in for the heavy work, and Pete, a man of indeterminate age and approximately 7 words per day, who managed the horses and seemed to function as the ranch's institutional memory. The woman who cleaned, a Mrs. Torrance, came Mondays and Thursdays, looked at Mara with the careful blankness of someone who'd been instructed not to have opinions, and left. Lena existed in the ranch the way a ghost might, present in the space but not quite occupying it. She followed routine with the compliance of a child who'd learned that resisting things took energy she didn't have. She got up. She got dressed. She sat where she was put. She went to bed when she was told. She did not, by default, eat. Mara did not push. She cooked in the kitchen every morning, and she talked to the air, and she set a small plate near wherever Lena happened to be sitting. Not in front of her, so that felt like a demand. Just near. Within reach. She made the butter cookies again, and soft rolls, and once a little pan of sweet corn porridge that she ate herself first, with obvious pleasure, and left the rest where Lena could get to it. On the 3rd day, Lena picked up a roll. On the 5th day, she ate most of her breakfast. On the 7th day, she asked, quietly, to the middle distance, in that small, rusty voice, if the porridge could have honey on it. "It absolutely can," Mara said, without making any fuss about it at all. It was during the 2nd week that Lena started talking. Not fluently, not the way healthy children talked. It came in small pieces, carefully distributed, like she was testing how much the air could hold. "My mama used to braid my hair," she said one morning, while Mara was rolling out pastry and Lena was sitting at the table with a cup of warm milk. She wasn't looking at Mara when she said it. Did she do it the same way every time, or different ways? A pause. Different. She knew lots of ways. Another pause. She said hair remembers things. Mara pressed her rolling pin into the pastry. What did she mean by that? I don't know. The child was quiet for a moment. I think maybe she meant... She stopped. I don't know. Might be worth thinking about, Mara said. Sometimes things your mama said make more sense later. They kind of arrive, like bread. Lena looked at her then, that serious dark-eyed look. Like bread? Takes time. Can't rush it. The corner of Lena's mouth moved. Not a smile exactly, but something on its way there. Elias came into the kitchen one evening toward the end of the second week and stopped in the doorway. Mara had her back to him. She was washing up after dinner, the steam rising from the basin, and she was listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. The horses shifting, the wind picking up, the far-off sound of Pete's tuneless whistling somewhere near the barn. She asked for seconds tonight, Elias said. Mara didn't stop washing. She did. First time in... He stopped. She could hear him working through the arithmetic of all the nights when that hadn't happened. A long time. She's getting her footing back. A long pause. She heard him move, the particular sound of a man who'd walked across a lot of hard ground trying to figure out where to put his weight. I don't know how to thank you, he said finally. It came out stiff, like it had been rehearsed and the rehearsal hadn't helped. You don't need to. She rinsed a pot. You're paying me. That's not... He stopped again. She heard him exhale, a short, rough sound. It's not the same thing, and you know it. She turned around then because it seemed like the thing to do. He was leaning against the doorframe, and he looked for the first time since she'd met him like something had relaxed in him. Not all the way. Not the way a man relaxes who's done worrying. But somewhere around his eyes, the constant braced-for-impact look had softened slightly, and he was watching her with something she couldn't quite name. She's going to be all right, Mara said. She's not there yet, but she's heading that way. How do you know? Because she asked for honey, Mara said. Children don't ask for honey when they've given up wanting things. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, like he was filing that away somewhere he'd remember it. You should eat something too, Mara said, because she'd noticed, had been noticing for 2 weeks, that he made sure Lena's plate was full and then ate whatever was left in a distracted, perfunctory way, standing at the counter, like his own hunger was a bureaucratic matter to be dealt with efficiently rather than something that required actual attention. He blinked. I'm fine. I didn't say you weren't. She picked up the plate she'd set aside earlier and put it on the table. Roasted chicken, biscuits. Vegetables from the garden she'd started putting back together. The neglected bed she'd been working in the mornings between baking and cooking. Sit down and eat it properly. He looked at the plate, then at her. You are very... He started. Direct? Yes. Sit down. He sat down. She turned back to the washing up. A few minutes later, she heard the quiet, steady sounds of someone eating, and there was something about that, something about the ordinary domesticity of it. The kitchen warm, the ranch quiet, a man finally eating a proper meal, that sat in her chest with a weight she recognized as something she'd been missing for a long time without having the right words for it. By the beginning of the third week, something had changed in the ranch itself. It was hard to point to exactly. Not a single thing, but 100 small ones. The shuttered feeling of the house had begun to open up. Mara had gotten the kitchen garden properly cleared and planted. It was late in the season, but not too late, and there would be something by fall. She'd asked Pete about the broken porch railing, and Pete had fixed it in an afternoon without any ceremony. Just appeared one morning with tools and fixed it, the way Pete did things. Elias had started coming in from the fields at mealtimes instead of grabbing whatever was nearest and eating it in the saddle. And the three of them, Elias, Lena, Mara, sat down at the kitchen table and ate together. And the conversation was imperfect and sometimes silent and occasionally awkward in the way of people who were still figuring out how to be around each other. But it was there. Lena had started smiling. Not constantly, not in a fixed, performed way. In the specific, intermittent, slightly startled way of someone rediscovering that smiling is something they're capable of. She'd smile at something the cat did, a large, self-important orange animal named Patch, who had appeared from nowhere 3 weeks ago and annexed a chair near the stove, and then looked briefly surprised at herself, as if she'd forgotten she was allowed to find anything funny. She asked Mara one afternoon about the recipe for the butter cookies. Can I help make them? She asked. very carefully, the way she still asked for things. I was going to do them tomorrow, Mara said. You want to come in early and help? Lena thought about it seriously. Yes, she said. Then, more quietly, Mama let me help sometimes. In the kitchen. She looked down at the table. I was too little to do very much. You're bigger now, Mara said. There's more you can do. Lena looked up at her. It was one of those moments. Mara would think about it later, lying awake in the small room Elias had given her at the end of the East Hall, listening to the ranch settle around her. It was one of those moments where a person was right on the edge of something, where they were deciding, without quite knowing they were deciding, whether to step forward or back. Lena stepped forward. Will you show me? She asked. Tomorrow morning, Mara said, soon as the oven's hot. On the morning she woke to find a note slipped under her door, she didn't think much of it at first. Then she read it. It was written in the stiff, formal hand of someone who'd had the same handwriting since childhood. We know what you are doing there. A decent woman does not live in a man's house. The children of this town are watching. You should be ashamed. She sat with it in her hands for a moment. Then she folded it carefully, put it in the pocket of her apron, and went downstairs to start the oven for the butter cookies. Lena was already waiting at the kitchen table. You're early, Mara said. I woke up early, Lena said. A pause. I was thinking about the brown sugar. The brown sugar. You said it was part of the secret. I was thinking about how much. Mara looked at the child, bright-eyed and serious, hands folded on the table, clearly having spent some portion of the night genuinely considering the mathematics of cookie making. And something in her chest did a complicated thing. Let's find out, she said, and reached for the flour. In her apron pocket, the note crinkled when she moved. She did not take it out again. The note was not the last one. A second arrived 4 days later, tucked into the gap of the front gate post where the wood had split and left a narrow slot. Someone had to have walked up the track at night to leave it there, which meant someone had made the deliberate choice to come out 6 miles in the dark just to say what they wanted to say. This one was shorter. Your kind of help is not wanted here. Go back to town where you belong. Mara read it standing in the morning cold with her shawl pulled tight and the mountains still pink with first light, and then she did the same thing she'd done with the first one. Folded it. Pocket. Went inside to start the stove. She hadn't told Elias about either of them. It wasn't that she thought he wouldn't care. She suspected he'd care rather more than was useful. The problem with telling someone that people were leaving threatening notes at his gate was that it tended to make a man want to ride into town and be loud about it. And the last thing this particular situation needed was loudness. What it needed was exactly what she was already doing. Heads down, work done, days passing. Time was the only currency that actually bought anything in cases like this, and she intended to spend as much of it as required. Besides, there was too much else to pay attention to. Lena had started eating breakfast every morning without being coaxed. Not enthusiastically, not the way a healthy child ate who'd never learned to be afraid of wanting things, but steadily, reliably, showing up at the kitchen table and sitting down and eating what was in front of her. Mara noted this the way she noted everything, without making it into a production. She put the food down. She sat across from her. She talked about inconsequential things. The garden, the cat's ongoing dispute with the fence post, something she'd once seen a crow do that had puzzled her for years. And Lena listened and ate and occasionally offered something in return. The morning they made the butter cookies together was the first time Mara heard her laugh. It was an accident, as real laughter usually is. Lena had been measuring out the brown sugar with the small tin scoop Mara had given her, concentrating on it with the kind of whole-body intensity that children bring to tasks they've decided matter enormously, and she'd misjudged the edge of the bowl. Sugar went sideways across the counter in a fine brown cascade, some of it into the flour, most of it onto the floor, and the cat Patch, who had been sleeping near the stove in his usual territorial sprawl, lifted his head, looked at the sugar with profound interest, and then stood up and walked directly through it, leaving little brown paw prints in a trail toward his food dish. Lena looked at Mara. Mara looked at Patch. Patch sat down in the middle of the sugar, looked at both of them with great dignity, and began washing his face. Lena laughed. It came out small and slightly startled, like it had escaped before she could decide whether to allow it, and then her hand went to her mouth as if she might push it back in, And then it came again, bigger this time, and she couldn't stop it. Mara swept up the sugar without rushing. He does that, she said. Makes himself part of whatever's happening. Very opinionated animal. Lena was still laughing. There were tears starting at the corners of her eyes, the helpless kind that come with unexpected laughter, and she looked simultaneously delighted and bewildered by herself. Mama would have laughed at that, she said, when it wound down. She said it simply, without breaking. Not the way grief usually worked in its early stages, the way a single mention could crack everything open. She said it like she was reporting a fact, a true thing about her mother that she wanted to have out in the air. She sounds like she had a good sense of humor, Mara said, which was not a deflection and not a platitude. It was just an acknowledgement. She did. Lena looked at Patch, who had relocated himself to the chair by the window and was now ignoring them with great expertise. She laughed at the wrong times. Papa always said she had the worst timing. A pause. He always laughed when he said it. He misses her, Mara said. We both do. The child was quiet for a moment, something moving across her face that was complicated and sad, and also, somehow, not entirely dark. But I think she would have liked you. Mara was quiet for a beat. I would have liked her, she said finally. Anyone who laughs at the wrong times, we'd have gotten along fine. Lena picked up the scoop. Can we start over with the sugar? Already measured more, Mara said, and pushed the fresh bowl forward. It was Pete who told her about the talk in town, and he did it in the oblique, sideways manner of a man who'd spent 40 years saying necessary things without using more words than absolutely required. He came in for his mid-morning coffee. He did this every day, appeared at the kitchen door, accepted a cup, stood near the window with it, and left. And on this particular morning, he stood there a little longer than usual, looking out at the yard where the two horses were moving in the morning light. And then he said, You know they're talking. Mara, who was cutting up the vegetables she'd pulled from the garden that morning, said, I'd be surprised if they weren't. Clara Hennessy's been saying things. He said Clara Hennessy's name the way you'd say the name of a weather condition, not with particular hostility, just as a fact about the landscape. Got some of the other women with her. What kind of things? Pete shrugged with one shoulder, which was his version of an extensive explanation. The kind, about a widow living in a widower's house. He drank his coffee. You know the kind. She did. She'd known this was coming since the first note appeared in the gatepost. Probably before that. Probably since she'd agreed to come out to the ranch and had seen the way Clara Hennessy's head had turned as she'd passed the dry goods counter the following Tuesday. The way the watching had a particular quality to it, speculative and hungry in the way of people who are already composing the story they're going to tell. It'll pass, Mara said. Pete made a sound that suggested he wasn't sure she believed that any more than he did. Elias know? No. Pete drank the last of his coffee, set the cup on the counter, looked at her for a moment with his small, sharp eyes. He's going to. I know. He nodded, once, put on his hat, which he'd taken off when he came inside and held in both hands for the duration, and walked back out into the yard. Mara kept cutting. The knife worked through a carrot with a clean, even motion, and she watched her own hands and breathed steadily and thought about what she was actually afraid of, and whether the things she was afraid of were the things that were likely to happen. What she was afraid of was Lena. Not the gossip itself. She'd been gossip before, had been the subject of it for most of 4 years, knew its particular character, the way it flared and then needed tending, or it died down. What she was afraid of was what it would do to the child who was only now beginning to come back to the surface. Lena had just started trusting that the world would not take everything from her again. She had just started eating, started talking, started laughing at the wrong moments because she'd been raised by a woman who found something funny in the wrong moments. She was still fragile in all the hidden ways. The places where a person breaks are never the visible ones. If the town decided to make this ugly, and the town was capable of making things very ugly, she had personal evidence of this, then the people it would hurt most were the ones who could least afford it. She kept cutting. The ranch changed that month the way seasons change. Not all at once, but in so many small and specific ways that you could look back from a distance and not recognize where you'd started. Mara put the kitchen garden to rights, properly this time, with stakes and string and a logic to the rows that would make the fall harvest easier to manage. She found seeds in a tin at the back of the pantry, some of them still viable, and got them into the ground. She repaired the kitchen shelving that had pulled away from the wall on one side and balanced the door that had started sticking in the frame. None of these things were asked of her. They were just things she noticed needed doing, and her hands didn't know how to stay idle, and the doing of them settled something in her that she hadn't realized was unsettled. Elias noticed. Elias. She could tell he noticed because he didn't say anything directly about it. He was that particular variety of man who showed attention by not intruding on whatever you were doing, by quietly making it easier rather than commenting on it. The first time she'd spent a morning on the garden, he'd come past at noon and simply left a pitcher of water and an empty glass on the porch railing without a word and gone back to whatever he was doing. The time she'd fixed the shelving, he'd come into the kitchen the next morning, opened the cabinet, closed it, and then looked at it for a moment like he was acquainting himself with the fact that it shut properly now. "You fixed that," he said. "It was going to pull all the way out if it wasn't caught." He nodded. He didn't say thank you, which she didn't mind. The way he'd said "you fixed that" had contained the thank you folded inside it. Their evenings had developed a pattern without anyone deciding on one. After dinner, after Lena had been settled, teeth brushed, into bed, a process that Mara had taken to participating in by sitting on the edge of the bed and talking until the child's eyes went heavy. Not stories exactly, just the same kind of quiet, inconsequential talk she used in the kitchen, the particular frequency that seemed to work. Mara would come back downstairs and find Elias at the kitchen table with whatever needed his attention. Receipts, a letter from the cattle buyer, a map of the East Field with notes in the margins. She would make tea, or sometimes he made it, and they would sit, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they didn't, and it was not exactly comfortable. There was still something careful about both of them, the particular cautiousness of people who'd each been hurt and had learned to treat trust as a limited resource. But it was not uncomfortable either. It was the honest middle ground where two people are when they haven't decided yet what they are to each other and are not going to rush the deciding. One evening in the third week, he said, without looking up from his papers, "What did you do?" "Before. I know you baked, but—" "I was a baker's wife," she said. "Before that, I was just a baker's daughter. It's all I've ever known." "Thomas Calloway? You knew him?" "A little. Enough to say good morning at market." He finally looked up. "He died, 4 years ago now?" 4.5. "Hard." "Yes." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "It was. And then it was less hard. And then it was just something that happened. The shape of things." He was quiet for a moment. "Does that happen with all of it? It just becomes the shape of things?" She thought about the question genuinely, because it deserved a genuine answer. "I think so. Not that you stop missing them, but at some point you stop missing the future you thought you'd have and start just living the one you've got." A pause. "That's different for everyone, though. And for children it takes longer, I think, because they don't have enough past yet to put the future into context." He looked at his hands, spread flat on the table. "Lena asked me last week if her mother could still see her, from wherever she went." He stopped. "I didn't know what to say." "What did you say?" "I said I thought so. I don't know if that was right." "It wasn't wrong," Mara said. She needed a yes. At her age, with where she is right now, she needed a yes. He looked at her. There was something in it. She'd gotten used to the way he looked at her, which was direct and occasionally unsettling in the way of someone who'd stopped bothering to pretend they weren't looking. Something that asked a question he wasn't going to put into words yet. "You're good at this," he said instead. "I had good teachers." "Your mother?" "And grief." She picked up her cup. "Grief teaches you a lot about what people actually need versus what they ask for." He was quiet for a long time after that, not uncomfortably, just the silence of a man turning something over. When she went upstairs that night, she stood at the window of her room for a moment and looked out at the dark and the mountains and the particular depth of quiet that only existed this far from town. The notes in the front gate, Clara Hennessy's working mouth, the way the town had arranged itself around the simple fact of her presence here, and decided it meant something other than what it was. She thought about leaving, not because she wanted to. She was aware, with a clarity that made her uncomfortable, that she did not want to leave, but because the calculation of harm was always there, running in the background. Was she doing more good than the trouble she was bringing in? Was Lena better off with her here and the town's hostility focused on this ranch, or better off without her and left in a version of the quiet that had been slowly killing her before? The second question was harder because she suspected she knew the answer, and the answer wasn't the one that let her leave. Lena was eating. Lena was talking. Lena was asking about sugar ratios and laughing at the cat, and telling small, careful things about her mother with an ease that had been completely absent 6 weeks ago. Whatever was happening in this kitchen, in these evenings, in the pattern they'd all fallen into without designing it, it was working, and working in the specific way that fragile things work, which is to say that it would not survive being interrupted. She went to bed, bottom. The fields came back. That was the phrase that kept surfacing in her mind as the weeks turned. She'd heard Elias use it once, standing at the fence line with Pete, talking about the east pasture he'd let go during the bad months. We'll get the fields back before frost if the weather holds. She'd taken the phrase and applied it more broadly in her own thinking because it seemed right. The whole ranch had a quality of coming back. Not to some original pristine state, nothing came back to that, but back into use, back into purpose, back into the particular life of a place where people were paying attention. The fence line got mended, not by her. She didn't know fences, but she noticed the week Elias spent on it, coming in for dinner tired in a different way than he usually was, the satisfied physical exhaustion of a man who'd done the thing that needed doing, rather than the grinding exhaustion of someone trying to hold a situation together through sheer will. Pete organized the hay before the weather turned, and the 2 hands Elias had been paying came back full-time after weeks of part-time, because there was enough work to justify it again. The cattle moved better through the repaired pasture, and at the center of all of it, Lena, who had come back the way the fields had, which is to say imperfectly and sometimes 1 step backward for every 2 forward, but steadily in the direction of herself. She started doing small things, helping set the table. Talking to Pete when he came in for coffee. Small, factual conversations that Pete appreciated because he had no more interest in complicated emotional territory than Lena did, and they developed a sort of wordless accord, the 2 of them, based on coffee and the shared understanding that some things were better observed than discussed. She started spending time in the garden with Mara, not always working, sometimes just sitting nearby while Mara worked, the way children sit with adults they trust, not needing to interact, just needing the proximity. And she started asking about her mother. This was the thing that told Mara more than anything else that the child was healing. Not the eating, not even the laughing, the asking. Questions about her mother without the white-knuckled terror of someone who was afraid the answer might break them. She asked what her mother's favorite color was, and Elias told her red, the particular red of the blanket they'd had on the bed since before Lena was born. She asked if her mother had been good at braiding hair, and Elias said the best, and his voice cracked slightly on best, and Lena reached across the table and put her hand on his arm for a moment, a gesture so adult and precise in its understanding that Mara had to look down at her plate. One afternoon, while Mara was preserving the last of the summer tomatoes, and Lena was sitting at the kitchen table drawing something on a piece of paper she'd asked Pete for, the child looked up and said, "Mara, do you think missing someone gets smaller, or do you think you just get bigger?" Mara looked at her, set down the ladle. "Where did you hear that?" "I made it up." Lena said this with the simple matter-of-factness of a child who didn't yet know she'd said something extraordinary. "I was thinking about Mama, and it seems like sometimes the missing is the same size, but I'm bigger, so maybe that's how it works." Mara was quiet for a moment. "I think you might have just figured out something it takes most people a very long time to get to," she said. Lena considered this. "Oh." She went back to her drawing. Then, without looking up, "Is that good?" "Yes," Mara said. "That's good." It was a Tuesday when the trouble came properly. Mara was in town for the market. She'd kept up her Tuesday stall because stopping would have felt like losing something she wasn't willing to lose, and also because she was practical enough to know she still needed the income. And she was setting up in the usual way, the cloth flat, the pastries in their rows, when she heard Clara Hennessy's voice, and the particular quality of it told her before she'd processed any of the words that this was not going to be a morning that passed quietly. Clara was at the stall 3 down, talking to Margaret Pruitt, who ran the millinery and had opinions about everything and the volume to share them. Neither woman was being particularly discreet. They weren't trying to be. Mara understood that immediately. They were talking at a level calibrated to carry. Cannot imagine what Elias Boone is thinking, allowing it to go on this long. Well, you know what people are saying. What I'm saying is there are children in this town, and when women like that are permitted to carry on, women like that. Mara kept her hands moving, rearranged a row of tarts that didn't need rearranging. No one said a word to her face, which I think is a problem, frankly, because someone has to— Someone being you, Clara? A brief pause, and then, with the bright, resolute tone of a woman who'd been waiting for exactly this opening, someone has to. Mara looked up. Claire Hennessy was already looking at her. She had the focused, purposeful expression of a person who had decided that what they were about to do was righteous, which made it considerably more dangerous than simple malice. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, and even the Mrs. had an edge to it. "I wonder if we might have a word." Around them, the market did that thing it did. That collective realigning, the shift of attention. She could feel it. People slowing, finding reasons to linger near their stalls. The particular quality of silence that precedes the thing everyone's been waiting to watch happen. Mara stood up straight. "Good morning, Clara." "I'll get to the point," Clara said. She had positioned herself with Margaret Pruitt slightly behind her to one side, and two other women Mara recognized from the ladies' aid, Helen Marsh and the younger one, Dottie Farwell, who had the uncomfortable look of someone who'd been brought along to a situation more aggressive than advertised, ranged near. "There is a great deal of concern in this community about the arrangement at the Boone Ranch." "Is there?" Mara said. It wasn't a question. "There is. You're a widow living in a widower's home, and the nature of that arrangement is—" "I'm an employee," Mara said. "I was hired to help with Lena." "Lena." Clara repeated the name with a delicacy that suggested she had something to say about Lena specifically and had been waiting to get there. "I understand the child has been in a difficult way since her mother passed. We're all very sympathetic. But what that child needs is not—" She paused. "This." "What is this exactly?" The market had gone quiet. Clara Hennessy drew herself up. She was a small, fine-boned woman who compensated for her size with a quality of compressed certainty, and she brought it to bear now, fully. The example being set for that child by having an unmarried woman living under the same roof as her father, regardless of the stated reason, is not the kind of example this community considers appropriate. Mara looked at her. She had a lot of things she could have said. She was aware of all of them, stacked up, various sizes, various degrees of accuracy and impact. She chose none of them because the marketplace was not the right arena, and these were not the right witnesses, and the only person who would pay for anything she said here would be Lena. "I appreciate you sharing that," she said, which was not agreement and not apology, and Clara Hennessy heard all three of those things in it, which made her color slightly. "Mrs. Calloway." "I have customers," Mara said, and looked past her. Clara held her position for 2 more seconds. She'd expected something, argument or deflection or retreat, and gotten none of them. And then she turned, and the small group of women turned with her, and the market exhaled. Mara picked up the tongs, arranged the pastries again. Her hands were perfectly steady, but in the week that followed, she felt the shift. The market stall was quieter. 3 regular customers who had come every Tuesday for 2 years found reasons not to stop. Someone had scratched something into the wood of the post at the corner of her table. She found it one morning, a word she had been called before by people who felt they had the right. She scraped it off. She went home to the ranch every evening, cooked dinner, sat at the table with Elias and Lena, listened to Lena describe the argument Patch had conducted with a field mouse and lost. And she kept the notes folded in her apron pocket, and she said nothing, and she waited. The problem with waiting was that it gave her too much time to think about what was going to happen when things came to a head. And they were going to come to a head. She'd seen enough of Clara Hennessy to know she was the kind of person who didn't let things go once she'd decided they were her business. The town would decide it needed to do something. The town would come to the ranch, or someone would, or the pressure would build in some other direction she hadn't anticipated. And when that happened, she was not going to be the one who got hurt. Lena was going to be the one who got hurt. That knowledge sat in her chest the way hard things do. Not painful exactly, not all the time, but heavy. and always there when she breathed deep enough to feel it. She sat in the kitchen the night before everything changed, long after everyone had gone to bed. The fire had burned down to coals. Patch was a warm orange weight in the chair by the window, making the small sounds of an animal that had never once in its life had anything to worry about. Mara looked at the kitchen, at the shelves she'd fixed, the window she'd replaced the latch on, the garden visible in the darkness beyond the glass, the rose she'd planted that would come up after she was gone if no one let them go to ruin again. She looked at all of it for a long time. Then she went upstairs, sat on the edge of her bed, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to think about how much she did not want to leave. It was the worst possible time to have figured that out. She had not planned to leave. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the days that followed. She had not woken up that morning with leaving in mind. She'd woken up the same way she'd woken up every morning for the past 6 weeks, with the particular, quiet sense of purpose that came from knowing the day had a shape to it, knowing what needed doing, knowing who was waiting downstairs. She'd dressed, braided her hair back, gone down to start the stove, and Lena had been at the kitchen table already with Patch on her lap, which he only tolerated for approximately 4 minutes before reasserting his independence, and the morning had been ordinary. Good, even. The kind of good that doesn't announce itself. They were halfway through the butter cookies when the sound of wheels came up the track. Mara heard it first. She'd been listening for it, though she hadn't known she was listening for it, in the way you listen for things you're afraid of without acknowledging the fear. A particular quality of attention aimed at the front of the property, at the gate, at the distance. When she heard it, she set down the rolling pin and wiped her hands on her apron and looked out the kitchen window. 3 wagons, not freight wagons, the kind of wagons people rode in when they wanted to arrive together and make an impression of it. She could see at the distance the particular upright posture of Clara Hennessy on the front bench of the first one. Lena had heard it too. She was looking at Mara with the newly careful attention of a child who'd learned that certain sounds preceded bad things. "Stay here," Mara said. "Who is it?" "Someone I need to go speak with. You stay in here with Patch." She said it evenly, without the particular brightness people use when they're trying not to alarm children and thereby alarm them perfectly. She just said it like a fact. "I'll be right back." She went out through the front door and stood on the porch. There were 8 of them. Clara at the front, Margaret Pruitt beside her, Helen Marsh and Dottie Farwell from before. 3 others she recognized from the Ladies' Aid, the Colton sisters, who were twins in their 50s and identical in everything including opinion, and a tall woman named Ruth Barker whose husband ran the mill. And at the back, which she hadn't expected, Frances Pryor, who was not a woman but who served on the town council and had the slow, deliberate manner of a man who believed his presence at a thing conferred legitimacy on it. They came into the yard and stopped. Clara got down first. "Mrs. Calloway." She had dressed for this, not formally, but with intention, with the pressed collar and the good hat that meant she considered this a public occasion. "We've come to discuss the situation." "You've come a long way to discuss it," Mara said. 6 miles. "We felt it was important to address it directly." Clara looked past her at the house with the specific expression of someone conducting an inspection they've already formed conclusions about. "Where's Mr. Boone?" "Out working." Which was true. Elias and the hands had gone out to the south pasture before first light to deal with a section of fence the cattle had gotten into. She'd heard him leave. "If you'd like to speak with him, you can come back when he's not occupied." "Actually," Clara said with the pleasant firmness of someone who'd rehearsed this, "it's you we've come to speak with." Behind her, the Colton sisters nodded in tandem. Mara put her hands in her apron pockets. Her fingers found the edges of the folded notes there. She still had them both, the 2 she'd received, folded small and carried without knowing quite why. And she held on to them without thinking about it. "All right," she said. Clara stepped forward. The others arrayed themselves in a loose semicircle behind her. Not aggressive exactly, but positioned with the collective weight of a group that knows numbers mean something. Frances Pryor had stayed near the wagons, which told Mara he was there to witness and report back rather than participate directly. "This community," Clara began, with the measured cadence of a prepared statement, "has watched the situation at this ranch with increasing concern for a number of weeks. We are not here to be unkind. We are here because we believe that what is happening here is not appropriate, and that someone needs to say so plainly." "Someone has said so," Mara said. Several times, in writing. A small silence. Clara's eyes sharpened slightly. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. Mara kept her voice level. But go on. Clara's jaw tightened by a degree that only showed if you were watching for it. A widow living in a widower's home without marriage is not the example this community wishes to set. Elias Boone is a respected man. His late wife was a respected woman. What you are doing here, whatever it is, reflects poorly on his name, on the memory of Sarah Boone, and on the children of this town who observe these arrangements and learn from them. What I'm doing here, Mara said, is keeping his daughter alive. The directness of it landed. She watched it land, watched Clara absorb it and regroup, watched Margaret Pruitt shift her weight, watched Dottie Farwell look at the ground. We understand the child has been unwell, Clara started. She was starving herself, in grief. She hadn't eaten properly in 3 weeks when Elias brought me out here. The doctor had been twice and hadn't helped. Everyone in Red Hollow knew the situation and nobody came. She looked at Clara steadily. You didn't come. That's not... You didn't bring food. You didn't sit with her. You didn't write Elias a letter or stop by the ranch or send her anything at all. And now that someone has done those things, has done them, and they've worked, and his daughter is eating and talking and coming back to herself, oh, now you've come 6 miles to explain that it's inappropriate. She stopped. Let that sit for a moment. I'm trying to understand the logic. Clara's face had gone the particular red-edged white of a person who is furious and is trying to manage it in public. The child's welfare is not in question. It's the only thing in question, as far as I'm concerned. Mrs. Calloway. This from Helen Marsh, who had a softer manner than Clara and had clearly been deployed as the reasonable voice. We're not suggesting that what you've done for Lena isn't good. We're saying that the manner of it creates problems, that there are other ways this could have been arranged. A woman from town, coming in by day. Has anyone from town offered? Mara asked. Helen opened her mouth, closed it. Because Elias asked, Mara said. He stood in the market and he asked, and there was no one. And I came. And it has worked. And now you want to arrange it differently, more than a month later, when disturbing it would... She stopped herself, breathed. It would hurt her. You understand that. If you walked in there right now and told Lena that the arrangement was changing, it would hurt her in ways she's not ready for. She has been hurt enough. We are thinking of the child, Clara started again. Then think of her, Mara said. Think of specifically her, not your idea of what's proper, not what Clara Hennessy thinks about widows and widowers and what that implies about my intentions. Think of the actual child, who is in that kitchen right now making cookies, who asked me 3 days ago if missing people get smaller, or if you just get bigger, who ate her whole dinner last night and asked for seconds. Think of her. The yard was quiet. Ruth Barker had looked away. The Colton sisters had stopped nodding. Dottie Farwell was blinking hard at the middle distance in the manner of someone trying not to cry, which Mara found strange and then didn't, because Dottie Farwell was 23 and had 2 children of her own, and probably had not before this moment thought concretely about what the inside of this situation actually felt like. Clara had not moved, but something in her had recalibrated. Mara could see it, the infinitesimal adjustment of a person who'd come in absolutely certain and had encountered something that made certainty more expensive than she'd budgeted for. I don't think, Clara said more carefully now, that your intentions are the issue. Then what is the issue? Appearances. The word came out with a kind of desperate precision, like Clara was holding it up as the last thing standing. What it looks like. What people say. What people say, Mara repeated. Yes. She looked at Clara Hennessy for a long moment, at the careful hat and the pressed collar and the 6 miles of determined travel and the 7 people arrayed in a semicircle in the yard of a man who had nearly lost his daughter and had not had a single visitor from town in the months it was happening. I know what people say about me, Mara said quietly. I've known it for 4 years. Since Thomas died and I was just a widow with a pastry table and nothing about me that anyone needed. She kept her voice even. This was important. If her voice went anywhere, it would give them something to point to. I know what you say at the market when you think I can't hear. I know about the note in the gate post. I know about the word on my table post. I know, Clara. I have always known. She stopped. And I have stayed here because that child needed someone to stay. Not someone who came by day and left by evening. Someone who was there when she woke up from a nightmare at 2 in the morning. Someone who had bread warm in the oven when she came downstairs and wasn't hungry, but needed to be near something that smelled like it was worth coming down for. Her throat had tightened, but she was not going to let it go further than that. That's what I've been here for. Not for your appearances, not for what people say. Nobody spoke. And then from behind her, a voice said, "She's the reason I want to live again." Mara turned. Lena was standing in the doorway. She had not stayed in the kitchen. She had, in the particular way of children who are told to stay somewhere and don't, come to the front of the house and found a position where she could hear. And she had been there for some portion of this, and now she was standing in the doorway with Patch under one arm. The cat submitted to this indignity with his eyes half closed and the expression of an animal whose dignity was internally indestructible. And she was looking at Clara Hennessy with her dark, serious eyes. She said it again. Quieter this time, because the first time had come out louder than she'd meant. "She's the reason I want to live again." The yard did something then that Mara couldn't have described precisely. It shifted, the way air shifts before weather. Clara Hennessy looked at the child in the doorway, and something crossed her face that was complicated and uncomfortable, and Mara thought, not entirely without feeling. Lena was 5 years old. She was small, in her faded dress with the braids that Mara had done that morning, and she was holding a large orange cat, and she had said the most devastating thing any of them were going to hear that day, with the simple, factual delivery of someone who was not trying to devastate anyone, who was just saying the true thing because it was true. Helen Marsh made a small sound. Dottie Farwell had stopped blinking and let the tears go, which she appeared immediately embarrassed about. "Lena," Mara said softly, "go back inside." "But inside, sweetheart, take Patch." Lena looked at the women, back at Mara. She set her mouth in the way she'd learned from somewhere, from her father probably, or from some older instinct about standing ground. And for a moment Mara thought she was going to argue. Then she turned and went back in. The door closed. The yard was very quiet. Clara Hennessy looked at Mara. Something had gone out of her face. Not the conviction, maybe, not all the way, but the certainty that she was the injured party in this situation, which was the thing that had been powering her, and without it she seemed smaller and a little tired. "That," said a voice from the back of the group, "is enough." Elias was at the fence line. He must have come up the track from the south pasture field, come through the side gate she hadn't heard open because she'd been focused on what was in front of her, and he was standing at the edge of his own yard with dirt on his boots, and his hat pushed back, and the expression of a man who had been listening for at least as long as Lena had. He walked forward. He had the gait of someone who had decided something and wasn't reconsidering. The kind of walking that makes people step back slightly without knowing they're doing it. Clara Hennessy stepped back slightly. He came and stood next to Mara. Not in front of her, next to her, with maybe a foot of space between them, which felt, in the geometry of that moment, like a statement. "Clara," he said. He used her first name the way you do with someone you've known all your life and don't particularly like. Margaret, Ruth. He looked at each of them in turn. Not long, just enough. "Helen?" He stopped on Helen Marsh for a moment, and Helen had the grace to look away. "I'm going to say something, and I'm going to say it once." Nobody answered. Nobody was going to interrupt him. "My wife died in March," he said. His voice was flat and factual, the way people talk when they're keeping a tight grip on something. "By May, Lena had stopped eating. I went to the doctor twice. I went to the Reverend once." He paused. "Let that land. I didn't go to the Ladies' Aid because I didn't think the Ladies' Aid could help. Turns out I was right about that." He looked at the group, and not one of them held his gaze. "I asked in town if anyone could help with her, help with Lena specifically, and not one person offered. Not one. I'm not saying that to wound you. I'm saying it because it's true. And the truth of it is the context for everything else." He breathed. Mara could see the muscles in his jaw working. "Mara Calloway came out here and she did what none of you did. She sat with my daughter on the floor and she was patient and she was present and she came back the next day and the next one. She fixed things in this house that I didn't have the capacity to fix because I was barely keeping my head above water. She got my daughter eating, she got her talking, she got her laughing. He stopped. I heard what Lena just said, and I hope you heard it too because she's 5 years old and she was starving herself to death 8 weeks ago. And you're standing in my yard talking about appearances. Another silence, longer this time. Now, he said, with a quietness that was harder than volume, you're going to get back in your wagons, and you're going to go back to town, and you are not going to come to this property again to speak to Mara about this. If you have concerns about how I choose to run my household, you may address them to me, directly, in town, in your own names. He looked at Francis Pryor, who had stayed very still near the wagons through all of this. That applies to the council too, Francis. Francis Pryor, to his credit, nodded once. He'd heard enough of it to know the ground had shifted. Clara Hennessy opened her mouth. Clara, Elias said, and the way he said it was not angry. It was something worse than angry. It was finished. I've known you my whole life. You babysat Sarah once, before we were married. You know exactly what kind of man I am, and exactly what kind of situation this is. So I need you to be honest with yourself about why you came out here today. Not what you told yourself, but why. He held her eyes. Go home. Clara looked at him, looked at Mara. Something complicated happened in her face. Not remorse, maybe. Not yet. That would take longer and might never arrive. But a kind of recognition. She turned and walked back to the wagon. The others followed. Even the Colton sisters, who had opinions about everything, went silently. Mara and Elias stood in the yard and watched the wagons turn and go back down the track. She could hear the wheels on the dry ground, the sound getting smaller, until it was just the ranch again. The horses in the pasture, the wind, the particular quiet of a place that has been disrupted and is settling back to itself. Elias let out a long, slow breath beside her. How long were you listening? She asked. Long enough. He ran a hand over the back of his neck. You should have told me about the notes. She didn't ask how he knew. Pete, probably. Or he'd found one himself and hadn't said anything to her either, which would be exactly his style. I didn't want to make it into something larger than it needed to be. It needed to be larger, he said. It needed to be the kind of thing where I knew what was happening in my own yard. She accepted that. It was fair. Lena didn't stay in the kitchen, she said. I noticed. She was there for most of it, I think. I know. He was quiet for a moment. She's been listening from doorways her whole life. She gets it from her mother. His voice did the thing it did when he mentioned Sarah, a fractional tightening, quickly controlled. Sarah always knew things before anyone told her because she couldn't help being where the information was. Mara nodded. They stood there a moment longer in the yard, not moving. The day had continued around all of it. The sun was where it should be, the air smelled of dry grass and the particular mineral smell of the coming autumn. The chickens had gone back to whatever chickens did when the drama had passed. They'll go back and tell it their own way, Mara said. They always do. It won't stop. Clara's not the kind to let it go. She looked at him sideways. You know that. I know that. He turned and looked at her, the same direct look she'd gotten used to and hadn't gotten entirely comfortable with. What I said in there, that's what I meant. I said it once, and I meant all of it, but it doesn't change what they're capable of. He paused. Are you afraid of them? Mara considered the question honestly. Not for myself. He understood that. She could see him understand it. Lena, he said. Yes. He looked at the house, at the closed front door. She told them she wanted to live again, he said, very quietly. She told 8 strangers in my yard that she wanted to live again because of you. He stopped. I need you to know that I heard that I understand what that means. Not just for her, what that means about what you've done here. Mara looked at the chickens, at the garden fence she'd mended last week, at the place where the porch railing had been fixed and the paint was a slightly different shade at the join. I wasn't going to leave, she said, which was what she'd told herself that morning, and it was still true, and she wanted him to know it. Good, he said. They went inside. But the town did not go quietly. She had expected this. The part of her that was always calculating the shape of things had expected it. But knowing something is coming and experiencing it are 2 entirely different arrangements of the same information. The first consequence was the market stall. She went the following Tuesday, and 3 of the stalls around hers had been repositioned, slightly, deliberately, so that there was a gap on each side of her table that hadn't been there before. It was a small thing. It was also completely intentional. Someone had arranged those stalls, and everyone who walked past knew what the gap meant, and the fact that no one said anything about it made it louder. Her Tuesday sales dropped by half. She went home and baked twice as much as usual the following week, and sold it all regardless, because the only response she had available was to make the thing she made and bring it to the place she'd always brought it and be there when it was hard to be there, which was, she'd found, the only strategy that had ever actually worked. The second consequence was the note left at her house in town. Not the ranch, her house, the small one at the edge of town where she still came once a week to check on things and keep the garden from dying entirely. Someone had left it on the doorstep. This one didn't have words. It had a drawing, the kind of drawing that wasn't meant to wound and manage to. Anyway, precisely because of its crudeness, 2 figures and a child and a slash through all 3 of them. She stood and looked at it for a moment, standing on her own doorstep in the early morning. Then she picked it up, folded it, put it in her pocket with the others, and went inside to water the garden. The third consequence she hadn't anticipated. Lena was quieter. Not the old quiet. Not the gone-away quiet of the first weeks, the white-knuckled silence of a child who'd checked out of the present. This was something different, smaller, more specific. She was thinking about something she hadn't figured out how to ask yet. It came out on a Thursday evening while Mara was washing Lena's hair over the basin. It was a thing they'd developed into a ritual, hair washing. Lena had a lot of it, thick and dark, and it needed care, and she'd begun asking Mara to braid it after the washing in various configurations, working through the ones she remembered her mother doing and some she invented herself. "Mara," Lena said. Those ladies." A pause. "Were they saying you should go?" Mara worked the rinse water through carefully. "They were saying some things." "Were they saying you should go?" She wasn't going to lie to her. She'd decided early on that the currency she had with this child was honesty. Not the harsh, unfiltered kind, but the kind that didn't pretend things were different than they were. Because Lena had lost her mother and learned that the world didn't arrange itself kindly, and she knew when she was being managed. "They were saying they didn't think I should be here," Mara said. "Yes." Lena was very still under her hands. "Are you going to go?" "No." "But..." She said it without hesitation, which was how she meant it. Not because of them. "But they might make you." Mara started working through a gentle tangle near the back. "Nobody makes me do anything, Lena. That's one thing I can tell you about me. Papa told them to go away." "He did." "He was angry." Lena thought about this. "He doesn't get angry very much. When he gets angry, it means he really means it." "I noticed that too." Another silence. Mara could feel the child processing, could feel the particular quality of a 5-year-old's thinking, the thoroughness of it, the way children work through things with their whole selves. "I said something," Lena said. "To them. Did I... Was that wrong?" Mara stopped, moved around so she could see the child's face. Lena was looking at the water in the basin, not at her, with the expression of someone who'd been turning a question over for days and had finally said it out loud. "What made you say it?" Mara asked. Lena was quiet for a moment. "They were talking about you like you were bad, and you're not bad." She picked at a thread on her sleeve. "And I thought, they don't know. They don't know what it was like before. They don't know that I didn't want to get up in the morning, and you made me want to get up in the morning." She finally looked at Mara. "So I said it." "That wasn't wrong," Mara said. "That was honest, and it was brave." "Were you scared when they came?" Mara thought about this. "A little," she said, which was honest. "Not for me, for you." Lena looked at her for a long, assessing moment, with those dark, serious eyes that had been assessing things too carefully for a 5-year-old ever since the beginning. "I'm not scared when you're here," Lena said. Mara looked at her, felt the weight of that, not sentimental. Not the way people made these moments into something decorative. Just the actual weight of it, the thing a person carries when someone small has decided you are what keeps the world from tipping over. "Come on," she said. Let's do the braid. The weeks that followed had the quality of a held breath. The ranch continued its recovery, which was real and ongoing regardless of what was happening in town. The fall harvest from the garden came in better than she'd expected, and she preserved what she could. And Elias stopped at the kitchen door one morning and said the cattle prices had come in well this season, and he was going to be able to pay for the north fence repairs, and it would have felt like a small victory in any ordinary month. But the town's pressure did not ease. Clara Hennessy had not ridden out again, but she didn't need to. She simply kept talking, and Red Hollow was small enough that talking was its own kind of action. Mara heard things in fragments, the way you hear things in small towns, a sentence overheard at the market, something Pete mentioned in his oblique way, a look from someone who'd been cordial for years and now found reasons not to stop. The market stall kept its gap on each side, like a quarantine. Elias came to the market with her one Tuesday, appeared at the table mid-morning, which he hadn't done before, and stood there in his working clothes with his hat on and bought 3 loaves of bread from her with careful, deliberate money and said good morning to every person who passed within 10 feet, by name. And the combination of all of that was not nothing. She saw Margaret Pruitt notice him and look away quickly. "You didn't have to do that," Mara said when he was headed back to his horse. "I needed bread," he said. She pressed her lips together to keep from smiling. "You bought 3 loaves. It's a big ranch." But the gap in the stalls didn't close. And at night, when the house was quiet and Lena was asleep and the fire had gone down, Mara sat in the kitchen and felt, for the first time, the thing she'd been refusing to feel. That this was not going to resolve the way she'd hoped. That Clara Hennessy was not going to tire of it. That the town was not going to gradually accept the situation and leave it alone. That the pressure was going to build and build. And the thing it was building toward was the moment when Lena got caught in the middle of it in a way she couldn't protect her from. Because Lena went to town sometimes. Elias took her to market once a month, let her see things, let her be around people. The way you did with children who needed to know the world was bigger than one ranch and one kitchen and one person who made cookies. And at the market, the gap in the stalls was visible, and the careful not looking was visible. And Lena was 5 years old, but she was not stupid, and the day was coming when she was going to ask Mara why people looked at her that way. And Mara was going to have to answer honestly. And the answer was going to be, because of me. Because of Mara. She sat with that. She thought about the drawing on her doorstep, the word on the market post, the notes in her apron pocket, still there, still folded, the paper softening with handling. All of it directed at her, and all of it landing, eventually, on the people near her. The worst part was that she understood it, in the way you understand things you hate. She understood that Red Hollow was a small, struggling place, and small, struggling places needed their lines drawn clearly. She understood that a widow in a widower's house, by the rules of the world they were all living in, was a provocation whether she intended it or not. She understood that Clara Hennessy was not purely malicious. She was a woman operating according to a set of rules she'd been given and had never seen reason to question, and by those rules, she was correct. None of which made it less wrong. None of which made it less certain that the harm was going to fall on Lena. She was still sitting there when the clock in the hall struck 2. Patch had moved from the chair to the floor near her feet, which was as close as he ever got to admitting he cared about anyone's company. She put her foot out and he leaned against it slightly, which was his version of affection. "What would you do?" she asked him. He said nothing, being a cat. She thought about staying. She thought about the consequences of staying, the ongoing pressure, the way it was going to shape Lena's life in this town, the way people would look at the child as they looked at her, and the damage that could do to a girl who was only just coming back from the edge of something. She thought about leaving. She thought about Lena's face when she'd said, "I'm not scared when you're here." She thought about both of these things for a very long time. When she finally went upstairs, she didn't sleep. She lay on her back in the dark of her room and looked at the ceiling and heard the ranch settling around her. The wood contracting, the horses shifting, the particular sound of a place breathing. And she made the decision that felt, at the time, like the only decision a person who loved someone could make. She would leave before it got worse. She told herself this was for Lena. She was not entirely wrong. She started in the small hours to think about how to do it in the way that would hurt least, which turned out to be the first mistake, because there is no way to leave someone who isn't expecting you to leave that doesn't hurt the worst possible amount. She didn't know that yet. She would know it soon. She left before sunrise. She had thought about it carefully. As carefully as a person can think about something they know is wrong, but have decided is necessary. And she had concluded that the only way to do it without a scene was to not be there when the scene would happen. Lena woke at 6, usually. Elias was up before 5, but out to the barn immediately. The morning routine so fixed by now that she could set a clock to the sound of his boots on the stairs. If she was gone before 5, before the barn, before the kitchen filled with the smell of the stove being lit, she would be down the track and onto the main road before anyone knew to look. She packed the same basket she'd arrived with: flour, butter, the vanilla beans she hadn't used, her 2 extra dresses, the hairbrush, the small tin of savings she kept at the back of the wardrobe. She left the wages Elias had paid her in the last weeks on the table. Not all of it, just what felt like more than she'd earned for the trouble she'd brought with her. And then she stood at the kitchen door and looked at the room for a moment. The shelves she'd fixed, the window latch, the garden visible through the glass, the rows she'd put in, the stakes and the string. Patch asleep in his chair, a perfect comma of orange fur, oblivious to everything. She left a note. She wrote it twice because the first one said too much, and the second one said less, and was therefore kinder. She put it on the kitchen table where Elias would find it before Lena came down. Then she walked out. The track was dark and cold, the mountains black against a sky that hadn't decided yet what color it was going to be. Her basket was heavier than she remembered it being on the way out. Or maybe she was just tired. The gate at the end of the track made a sound when she went through it, that dry metal sound of the latch. And she pulled it shut behind her and stood on the main road for a moment, alone in the particular silence of very early morning, and thought, this is the right thing. She thought it deliberately, the way you think things you need to keep believing. Then she walked toward town. The house felt different when she got back to it. Not changed. Everything was where she'd left it, the cracked blue pitcher on the shelf, the dried herbs in the window, Thomas's wooden sign leaning against the wall near the door, because she'd never found the right place to hang it and eventually stopped trying. But it had the quality of a space that had been waiting and was now registering, in its quiet way, that what it had been waiting for had not arrived. She unpacked the basket, put the flour away, put the butter in the cold box, hung her dresses on the hook behind the door. She did all of this with the methodical attention of someone keeping their hands busy so their mind had something to report to. Then she sat at her kitchen table and looked at the wall. She stayed there for a long time. She told herself, during that time, various things. That Lena would adjust. That children were more adaptable than adults gave them credit for. That Elias was capable, had been capable before she arrived, and would be capable now. That the town's pressure would ease once she was gone, because the pressure was about her presence, and without her presence there was nothing to press against. That this was the calculation that made sense, and she had made it clearly, and it was the right one. She told herself all of this. Some of it she almost believed. What she couldn't quite make herself believe was the part about Lena adjusting. Because she knew Lena. She'd spent 8 weeks knowing Lena in the specific, daily, granular way you only know someone you live alongside. The sound she made when she was pretending to be asleep and wasn't. The exact angle of her head when she was about to ask something difficult. The way she held the rolling pin. The way she said it's sweet about the first cookie she'd ever eaten from Mara's hand, with the particular intonation of someone who hadn't expected anything to be sweet. She knew the child. And because she knew her, she knew that Lena's particular damage was the damage of abandonment. Every person she'd loved had left or been taken. Her mother. The ordinary life she'd had before grief made everything unrecognizable. And Mara had walked in and been constant, and been present, and been the warm kitchen at 2 a.m, and the bread that smelled like it was worth coming downstairs for. And now Mara had left, without saying goodbye. She pushed back from the table, stood at the window and looked at the garden, which needed attention. She'd been away long enough that things had gotten ahead of her. And she thought about going out there, about the work of it, about the reliable way that physical labor managed to occupy the part of her brain that otherwise did damage. She went out. She was on her knees in the 3rd row, pulling something that had come up in the wrong place when she heard hoofbeats on the road. She didn't look up right away. Hoofbeats on the road were common enough. But these ones slowed and then stopped, and there was a particular quality to the silence that followed that made her sit back on her heels and look. Elias was at the garden gate. He had come fast. She could see it in the horse, which was breathing hard, and in him, which had the taut, controlled look of a man who had ridden 6 miles with something urgent at the center of him and was now doing the work of not letting it come out all at once. He was still in his working clothes, the same ones he'd have pulled on at 5 in the morning when he went to the barn, and he had her note in his hand. She recognized the paper, folded in half, held in a grip that had clearly been tighter earlier and was now being moderated. He looked at her kneeling in the dirt. She looked at him. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You left," he said. "I left a note." "I can see that." He looked at the note in his hand like it had offended him personally. "I can read. I read it twice." He folded it again, a gesture that had no practical purpose, just something for his hands to do. "I want to hear you say it out loud." Mara got to her feet, brushed the dirt from her knees. She was aware of how she looked, dusty and garden-grimed, having been on her knees in the mud, and she was also aware that this was not the kind of conversation where appearances were going to be relevant. "I left because I was making things harder for you and Lena than they would be without me," she said. "The town was the town." He said it the same way she might say the weather, as a fact of the environment, significant and uncontrollable. "You left because of the town." I left because of what the town is going to do to Lena, to how people see her, how they treat her. She has to live in Red Hollow. She has to grow up there. If I'm the reason people look at her sideways, she's not eating." The words stopped her. He watched them land. He hadn't said it cruelly, hadn't said it to wound her. She could hear that, but he'd said it precisely, the way you say a thing when you need it to be understood, and you don't have time to get to it gently. "It's been 4 days," he said, "since you left. 4 days and she's back to... It's not as bad as the beginning. She's not all the way back there, but she won't sit at the kitchen table. She won't..." He stopped. His jaw worked. "She found the sugar you'd measured out and left on the counter. The brown sugar, the bowl you'd set aside for cookies. She stood there and looked at it, and then she asked me where you went, and I..." Another stop. "I told her you had to go back to town for a while. I didn't know what else to say. And she looked at me and she asked if you were coming back, and I said I thought so. And she said, 'People always say that,' and then she walked out of the kitchen, and she hasn't been back in it since." Mara looked at the gate, at the garden beyond it, at her hands, which still had dirt in the creases. "People always say that." 5 years old, and she had already learned that I think so was the thing adults said when the answer was no. "Elias, she thinks you left because of her." He said it quietly. Not angry anymore, past the anger, which was worse. She hasn't said it directly, but she thinks it. "I know her. She thinks she did something. The thing she said to those women, or something she did wrong, or something she wasn't enough of." He pressed his lips together. "I can't convince her otherwise because I don't know what to tell her. I don't know the truth well enough to say it convincingly." The truth. She stood with that. "I left to protect her," she said. "I know that's what you believe." "It's true. It's half true." He opened the gate, which was something she noticed. He didn't ask. He opened it, which told her something about where he'd decided they were. He came into the garden and stopped a few feet from her and looked at her with the direct, unsentimental look she'd gotten accustomed to over 8 weeks and was startled to have missed. "The other half is that you got scared." She opened her mouth. "Not of the town," he said. "Of this, of what it was becoming." He let that settle. "You got comfortable there, with us, and that scared you, and the town gave you a reason that sounded like the right reason, and you used it. The accuracy of it was unpleasant in the specific way that accurate things are when you'd rather they weren't." "That's not..." she started. "Mara." She stopped. He waited. She looked at the garden, at the 3rd row she'd been clearing, at the stakes and string she'd put in, the rows that would feed someone next season if anyone kept after them. All the work she'd done in this small yard in the weeks she'd been away from the ranch, the work she'd thrown herself into because her hands didn't know how to be idle, and something in her was more capable of tending other people's things than of sitting still long enough to examine her own. "Yes," she said, Both things are true. He nodded. Once. Then I'm asking you to come back, he said. Not for me. I'm managing. But Lena is not managing, and I think you know that, and I think you need to hear that leaving did not protect her. It convinced her that everyone she loves leaves eventually. That is the one thing I cannot fix for her, that I can't be the one to fix because I'm her father and I was already there before, and what she learned from you was something different, that someone could choose to show up, that people who weren't obligated to stay could still stay. His voice had gone rough at the edges. He cleared it. And you left. She felt the truth of that in the specific location where hard truths tend to land. Not in the mind, where you can argue with them, but somewhere lower, in the chest, in the place where the things you know and the things you've done are held in proximity to each other. I thought I was protecting her, she said. Not defending it, just saying it. I know you did. He was quiet for a moment. But I'm asking you to come back. She looked at him. At the note still in his hand, folded and refolded, the paper going soft at the creases. At the tiredness around his eyes, which was different from the tiredness she'd seen in him at the beginning. Less desperate, more worn, the tiredness of a man who'd come close to solid ground and then felt it shift again. If I come back, she said carefully, the town situation doesn't go away. It's still there. I know that. Clara Hennessy doesn't. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. The town is going to do what the town is going to do. But my daughter is in my kitchen not eating because the person she trusted to stay didn't stay, and that I can do something about. He paused. Come back. She stood in her garden with the morning sun coming over the fence and her hands dirty, and her basket on the kitchen step where she'd left it when she came out to weed, and she thought about what she'd told herself walking down the track in the dark 4 days ago. This is the right thing. And she thought about how sure she'd been and how quickly sure had become something else. All right, she said. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. She'd gone inside for her basket and her good shawl, and the jar of honey she'd meant to bring with her the first time but hadn't. And when she came back out, Elias was waiting with his horse and the mare he'd brought for her without saying he'd bring one, which told her he'd left with more certainty than he'd let on. She mounted, and they went out to the road, and neither of them talked much. She was thinking about what she was going to say to Lena. She was also thinking about what Elias had said in the garden. The other half is that you got scared, and turning it over the way she turned difficult things over, which was steadily and without hurrying, not because she was comfortable with it, but because she'd learned that the only way through hard truths was through them. He was right. She had been scared, not of the town, not fundamentally. She'd been dealing with the town's version of her for years and knew its texture. She'd been scared of the other thing, the thing that had been growing in the ranch kitchen and the evening conversations and the ordinary evenings at the table, the thing that was made of all the specific details of being in that house. The way Elias looked up from his papers when she set the tea down, the way Lena had started reaching for her hand in the particular absent way that children reach for the person who is consistently there, the way she herself had started waking in the morning and feeling not just the purpose of the day, but the shape of the people she was going to see in it, and the weight of how much she had come to want to see them. She was not good at wanting things. She'd been not good at it for 4 years, had dismantled that capacity carefully, and kept the pieces in a box somewhere she didn't walk past. Because when Thomas died, she'd learned that wanting things that were capable of being taken was a particular kind of risk that not everyone could afford. And then she'd walked into a ranch kitchen and started making bread, and somewhere between the bread and the cookies and the evenings at the kitchen table, the box had opened, and she hadn't noticed until it was full. The fear, when she'd finally felt it, had presented itself as the town. Had said, this is about Lena, this is the right calculation. And half of that was true enough that she'd believed the whole of it. She looked at the mountains as they rode, at the flat, gold-edged light of late morning on the scrub, and the dry grass and the long view that you only got out this far from town, the sense of scale that made human problems feel appropriately sized. She really hasn't been eating? She asked. Not the way she was. He glanced over. She ate something yesterday. Not much. But she sat at the table for it, at least. That's something. It's something. He watched the road. She kept asking Pete about the cookies. whether the recipe was written down somewhere. Pete said, the corner of his mouth moved slightly. Pete said he didn't know anything about cookies, which is both true and extremely unhelpful. Pete's helpful in his own way. Pete is helpful in the ways Pete decides to be helpful, which are not always the ways you need. But he said it with the particular affection of a man who had depended on someone long enough to make peace with their limitations. He was good with her while you were gone, took her to see the horses more than usual, didn't talk about you, didn't not talk about you, just went on. He would. They came off the main road onto the track, and Mara felt, with a clarity that surprised her, the difference between the last time she'd come up this track and now. The first time she'd been moving toward something unknown. The second time she'd been leaving. Now she was returning, which was different from arriving. Returning had a weight to it, an acknowledgement that arriving didn't. The ranch came into view the same as always. The timber and stone, the mountains behind it, the fields that had come back over the course of 8 weeks from something neglected into something cared for. The garden stakes visible from the track. The fixed porch railing with its slightly different paint at the join. Pete was in the yard when they came in. He looked at Mara on the horse, looked at Elias, made the small sound of a man who is not going to say "I told you so" because "I told you so" was 3 words more than he typically used. "She in the house?" Elias asked. "Kitchen," Pete said. And then to Mara, with the economy of a man who had used up his daily words and was spending reserves. "Good." She dismounted, handed him the reins. The front door. The hall. The kitchen at the back with the light coming in from the garden window and the stove that hadn't been lit properly in 4 days. She could tell from the cold quality of the room. The shelves she'd fixed. The window latch. Patch in his chair, one eye open, registering her arrival with the resigned expression of an animal that had never expected to be surprised by anything, but had found, against its will, that it was pleased. Lena was at the table. She was sitting in her usual spot, the one she'd claimed in the first week without discussing it, the way people claim spots. She was not drawing, not reading, not doing anything in particular. She was sitting with her hands folded on the table, which was what Lena did when she was waiting for something but had stopped letting herself believe it would come. She looked up when Mara came through the door. She looked at her for a long moment, that dark, serious, too careful look. And then something happened in her face that was not one thing, but several things in very fast succession: disbelief, recognition, and then the specific crumpling of a child who has been holding themselves together for days and has now encountered the thing they were holding themselves together for. Her face broke. She didn't make a sound right away. Her face just broke. In the way a child's face breaks when they're trying not to cry and have failed at it, the bottom lip first, and then the eyes. And she slid off the chair and crossed the kitchen in 3 small, fast steps, and wrapped her arms around Mara's waist, and pressed her face into her apron and stood there shaking. Mara put her arms around her. She was aware peripherally that Elias had come in behind her and stopped in the doorway, but she didn't look at him. She held the child who was small and warm, and whose braids had come slightly loose on one side in the way they did when she slept on them, and she held her and didn't say anything for a while, because there are moments where the saying of things is just noise. Then Lena pulled back slightly and looked up at her with her red-rimmed eyes and her crumpled face and said, with the particular accusatory directness of a heartbroken child, "You left." "I did," Mara said. "You didn't say goodbye." "I know. I'm sorry." "I thought—" Lena stopped. Her chin wobbled. She pushed it back into steadiness with visible effort, which was a very Boone thing to do. "I thought I made you go." "You didn't." She said it simply, without the overproduction of reassurance that would have made it sound like a performance. Just said it like the fact it was. "You didn't make me go. I made a mistake. I thought leaving would help, and it didn't. I was wrong." Lena looked at her, processing. "Are you going to stay?" she asked. And Mara looked at her, at this 5-year-old who had been to the edge of something and had come back, who had told 8 strangers in a yard that the woman in front of her was the reason she wanted to live again, who had stood in a kitchen doorway with a large orange cat and said the truest thing anyone had said in that yard, and she thought about the notes in her apron pocket, and the gap in the market stalls, and Clara Hennessy's pressed collar, and the drawing on her doorstep, and all the ways Red Hollow had arranged itself against her presence. And she thought about the rolling pin and the brown sugar, and it's sweet. And do you think missing someone gets smaller? Or do you think you just get bigger, and the sound of a child's laugh startled out of her by a cat walking through spilled sugar? Yes, she said, I'm going to stay. Lena leaned back against her and exhaled, a long, complete sound, the full-body release of a child who has been bracing against something for days and has finally been told they can stop. Then, without moving away, she said in a smaller voice, Can we make the cookies? The oven isn't warm yet. Can we start it? Yes, Mara said. We can start it. The first hour back was quiet in the way of things reassembling. Mara got the stove going while Lena pulled the stool to the counter, their usual arrangement, the choreography of it coming back easily, the way things come back when they've been repeated enough times to become part of how the body knows to be in a space. She measured out the flour. She let Lena measure the brown sugar with serious, corrected accuracy. They'd been working on the tendency to overflow the scoop, and Lena did it with the concentration of someone who had decided that this was important and intended to get it right. Elias stayed in the kitchen, which he didn't usually do. He sat at the table with his coffee and his papers and didn't look at them. He watched, in the oblique way of a man who knows he's watching and doesn't want to make it obvious. And the kitchen filled up with the smell of the stove warming, and then the butter, and then the sugar melting into the dough. And gradually the cold quality of the room that had settled into it over 4 days changed. Pete came in for his mid-morning coffee and stood at the window and said nothing, which was normal. And then on his way out he stopped and said, to the door, rather than to anyone in particular, Garden's looking good. It was, as far as Pete went, a complete emotional declaration. Mara said, Thank you, Pete. And he left. And she heard Elias make a sound behind her that was close to a laugh. When the cookies came out of the oven, Lena ate 3 of them, standing at the counter, still warm, in the intent and deliberate way she ate things when she was truly hungry. She offered one to Patch, who examined it, looked at her, and walked away in a direction that communicated clearly that he had never been interested in cookies and couldn't imagine where she'd gotten that idea. He doesn't like them, Lena said. He's very particular. Mama would have liked them. She said this in the easy way she'd developed for mentioning her mother, not without feeling, but without the fear anymore, as if Sarah Boone had become something she could carry without putting down all her other things first. I'm sure she would have, Mara said. Lena licked the sugar from her thumb. Can I have another one? That's 4. Is that too many? Mara looked at her. This small person who had not eaten properly in 4 days and was currently working through her 3rd cookie on an empty stomach and asking permission for a 4th with the entirely reasonable expression of someone who felt they'd earned it. One more, she said. Lena took it immediately, before the answer could change. Pause. That evening, Elias stayed in the kitchen later than usual. Lena had gone to bed tired in the solid, satisfied way of children who have eaten enough and felt enough and are ready to be unconscious for several hours. Mara had sat on the edge of her bed and talked until the breathing went even, and then stayed a minute past that, the way she always did, just to be sure. When she came downstairs, Elias was at the table, not with papers this time. No receipts, no maps, no letter from the cattle buyer. Just a cup of coffee, going cold in front of him, and the particular quality of a man who has been working up to saying something. She put the kettle on, sat down across from him. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Once, twice. She waited. I need to say something, he said. And I need you to let me say it without interrupting, because I have to get through it in the right order, or I'll lose track of it. She nodded. He looked at the cup, then at her. When Sarah died, I thought the hardest part was going to be the grief. Mine. And it was hard. Harder than I'd had any way to prepare for. But the harder part, it turned out, was watching Lena and knowing that I was grieving, but I was also her father, and I had to keep going regardless. And there was a part of me that was still there, still moving, still doing what needed to be done. And Lena didn't have that. She just had the grief. And I couldn't... He stopped. I could not reach her. I tried everything I could think of, and some things I'd never have thought of on my own, and I could not reach her. And then I was standing in the market watching my daughter not eat, and a woman I'd barely spoken to got down on her knee in the dust and waited, and Lena took the cookie. He paused. She didn't say anything. I brought you out here and you fixed things, he said. The child. The kitchen, the garden, the way the house felt. Things I didn't even know needed fixing. You just looked at them and fixed them. And I paid you, and I thanked you badly, and I watched you do it, and somewhere in there I stopped thinking of you as someone I'd hired. He met her eyes directly, which was the only way he ever looked at anyone. I don't know when it happened, but I need you to know that it happened. Mara held his gaze. Her hands were around her cup, and the kettle was starting to tick on the stove, and somewhere upstairs Patch was doing something that involved a certain amount of movement. "What are you saying?" she asked. Because she needed him to say it. He exhaled. "I'm saying I don't want you here as an employee." "I know that." "I'm saying I want you here as—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm saying that when you left, the house told me you were gone before I found the note. The kitchen was cold and Lena wasn't eating, and even Pete was different, quieter than usual. And I rode to town because—" He put the cup down. "Because I am 41 years old, and I have spent a year being afraid of the wrong things, and I'd rather look like a fool asking for something than spend another day not asking." She looked at him. At the weathered hands flat on the table, the honest, angular face, the tiredness around his eyes that she knew now had been there since March, and had been slowly, over 8 weeks, becoming something less desperate. "You rode out to my garden," she said. "I did. In one of your good shirts." He looked down at himself, slightly caught. I wasn't, that's not relevant." "It is a little relevant," she said. He looked at her. Then something in his face shifted, and it was not quite a smile, but it was the precursor to one, the thing that came before the smile in a person who'd forgotten for a while that smiling was available to them. "Mara," he said, "will you stay? Not as just stay, as part of this, as part of us." He paused. "I'm not asking you to decide everything right now. I'm asking if that's something you'd consider." She thought about the box she'd kept closed for 4 years, about the things she'd put in it and the lid she'd kept on it and the careful way she'd built a life around it rather than through it. She thought about fear and what it cost and what the alternative cost and whether the mathematics of one could ever actually be better than the mathematics of the other. She thought about Lena upstairs, asleep, full of cookies, with her braids coming loose on one side. "I've been considering it for a while," she said. He looked at her. "I just needed to be asked," she said. He reached across the table. Not for her hand. He stopped short of that, which she noted, the particular restraint of a man who was trying to be sure of the ground before he put weight on it. He put his hand on the table between them, open. She looked at it. Then she put her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, careful at first, and then not. And they sat like that, in the kitchen, with the stove warm and the kettle quiet, and the ranch breathing around them in the dark. And neither of them said anything because there wasn't anything left to say that the quiet wasn't already saying. He asked her properly 3 days later. She hadn't been expecting it so soon, had thought there would be more weeks of the in-between, the careful navigation of what they were, the slow adjustment from what had been to what was coming. But Elias, she had learned, was not a person who did things halfway. He decided things and then did them, and the deciding, once made, didn't require an extended run-up. He came in from the fields in the late afternoon and he had washed his face and combed his hair, which were signals she'd come to read, and he stood in the kitchen doorway while she was taking bread out of the oven, and he said, "Lena, could you go check on Patch?" Lena looked at him with the suspicious intelligence of a child who knows when she's being removed from a situation. "Patch is fine. He was in his chair a minute ago." "Go make sure." "Papa." "Lena." She went, with the expression of someone who was going under protest and intended everyone to know it. Mara set the bread on the cooling rack and turned around. Elias was not doing what she'd expected. He wasn't nervous, or if he was, he'd folded it somewhere out of sight. He just looked at her steadily, in the way he'd always looked at her, the look she'd never entirely gotten comfortable with and now was not sure she wanted to be comfortable with because the discomfort was part of what it was. "Marry me," he said. "Not will you." Just the direct form, though the tone of it was a question. Not to quiet the town. Not because it solves the appearances problem, though it does. Because I want you here. Because Lena wants you here. Because the house is different when you're in it, and I've had it both ways now, and I know which one I want. He stopped. Marry me. She looked at him. That's the worst proposal I've ever heard, she said. He blinked, then carefully. How many proposals have you heard? One other. Thomas asked me properly, on a knee, with a speech. She watched his face. It was very nice. I'm not going to... He looked at her. Are you saying no? I'm saying your proposal needs work. Mara... Yes, she said. Obviously, yes. She turned back to the bread because if she kept looking at him, she was going to do something embarrassing. But you might want to practice for the next time, on the off chance there is one. Behind her, she heard him exhale. It was a long, complete sound. The particular exhale of a man who has been carrying something tensed up in him and has just been told he can put it down. There's not going to be a next time, he said. Good, she said. Then it doesn't matter. From somewhere in the direction of the front room, there was the sound of small feet that had very definitely not gone to check on Patch and had been listening from approximately 6 feet away. Lena, Elias said. A pause. Then, is she staying? Yes. Another pause, longer this time. Then, with the enormous satisfaction of someone who had seen this coming and was glad to be right, I knew it. Mara pressed her lips together. In his chair by the window, Patch opened one eye, assessed the situation, and closed it again. They were married on a Saturday in October, 3 weeks after Elias had stood in the kitchen doorway with his combed hair and his direct eyes and said, "Marry me," like it was a fact he was reporting rather than a question he was asking. Mara had not wanted a large wedding. Elias had not pushed for one. What they'd agreed on, in the practical, low-ceremony way they agreed on most things, was something simple. The small ceremony at the Justice of the Peace in Red Hollow, a witness or two, and then back to the ranch. That was the plan as she understood it on Friday evening when she went to bed in her room at the end of the East Hall for what she supposed was the last time she'd think of it as her room in that particular way. What she woke up to on Saturday was something else. The yard was full of people. Not the town, not all of it, but enough. Pete was there, standing near the barn in what appeared to be a clean shirt, an event so rare that she stood at the window for a moment just to verify it. The 2 ranch hands, Cord and young Davis, were there, cleaned up and awkward in the way of working men at celebrations. The family 3 ranches over, the Hendersons, who had been quiet allies over the past months, she'd seen their wagon pass on the road and wave when other wagons didn't, had driven in early. The schoolteacher, Miss Aldrich, who had come twice to the market stall in the past weeks and bought bread with the deliberate air of someone making a point, was there with her sister. There were others she knew by face, and some she barely knew at all. She dressed quickly, came downstairs to find Lena already up, in the good dress they'd sewn together last week. Lena had opinions about the ribbon, which was now blue rather than the original yellow, because Lena had stood in the dry goods store and said blue is better with the absolute authority of a 6-year-old who has recently discovered she has aesthetic preferences. You're late, Lena said. It's 7 in the morning. Pete's already here. Pete's always early. It's one of his qualities. Mara looked out the kitchen window at the gathering yard. Did you know about this? Lena had the expression of someone who absolutely knew about this. Papa said it was going to be a small wedding. This is not small. He said small for a wedding. Lena considered this distinction with great seriousness. I think that means different things to different people. Elias came in from the yard, saw her face, and had the good sense to look slightly apologetic. I may have mentioned to a few people. How many is a few? The Hendersons. And Cord told Davis, and Davis apparently... He looked out the window. Davis talks more than I realized. She looked at the yard, at the people gathering in it, the particular mix of them. Not the whole town, not Clara Hennessy and her faction, but the other part. The part that had been present all along without making itself loud. The way good things are often present without making themselves loud. All right, she said. All right. It's a nice day, she said. Let's not waste it. The ceremony itself was short and plain, the way she'd wanted. The Justice of the Peace, a dry, procedural man named Hatch, who had married half the county and seemed personally unmoved by any of it, read the words with the efficiency of someone who'd said them so many times they'd become a kind of shorthand. Elias said what he was supposed to say in a steady voice. Mara said what she was supposed to say in a steady voice. Lena stood between them holding Patch, who had been brought out for the occasion and was managing his dignity with visible effort. When Hatch said you may and Elias kissed her, it was brief and slightly off-center because Lena had shifted at exactly the wrong moment and bumped Mara's elbow. And the result was imperfect and entirely real, and Mara thought, good, let it be real. Afterward, Elias turned to face the gathered people in the yard. He was not a man who liked speeches. She knew this about him, had known it since the second week when she'd watched him try to thank her and find the words inadequate and give up. But he stood there with the October light on him, and he looked at the people who had come, and he said what he said. Most of you know what this last year has been, he started. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. The yard had gone quiet. Most of you know what Lena was like in the spring, and most of you know what changed, he paused. Mara came out to my ranch, and she got my daughter eating again. She got her talking and laughing and asking questions about sugar ratios at 6 a.m. A few people smiled. Lena looked up at him with the expression of someone who recognized herself in a story. She fixed things I didn't have the capacity to fix. She made this place feel like a home again when I had stopped knowing what home felt like. He looked at Mara. There were people in this town who tried to make her leave, who said things and sent notes and left words carved into her market post. I'm not going to name names because today is not that kind of day. But I want to say clearly, in front of all of you, that the woman who stood and took that and kept showing up for my daughter anyway, that is the kind of person this community ought to be grateful for. And I am grateful, every single day. The yard was very quiet. Mara looked at her hands. She had promised herself she was not going to cry at her own wedding, which was a promise she was currently in the process of breaking. Then Lena, still holding Patch, said loudly into the silence, "She makes good cookies too." Laughter, the real, surprised kind that breaks out of people before they decide to do it. Mara pressed her lips together, felt something loosen in her chest, some final tightened thing she hadn't known was still held there, and let it go. The celebration that followed was modest by any standard and felt, to Mara, like exactly enough. People ate. There was bread. She'd baked 3 days' worth, and the Hendersons had brought a ham, and Miss Aldrich produced a cake with the slightly anxious pride of someone who doesn't often bake and had committed to it anyway. Pete ate more than she'd ever seen him eat, standing near the barn with a plate, and when she passed close enough, he said, with great economy, "Good." She said, "Thank you, Pete." He nodded, went back to his plate. That was the whole of it, and it was sufficient. Clara Hennessy was not there. Mara had not expected her to be. Margaret Pruitt was not there. Helen Marsh was not there. The people who had come 6 miles in wagons to tell her she was the wrong kind of woman had not come today. And Mara found, standing in her own wedding yard in the October light, with her husband nearby and his daughter trying to get Patch to eat a piece of ham, that she did not feel the absence as a wound. She felt it as information. Some things resolved. Some things simply became clear for what they had always been. Francis Pryor did come. He arrived late and stayed near the edges and ate quietly, and when he left he stopped and said to both of them, "Congratulations," which was not an apology and was not a reversal of position and was also more than she'd expected from him, so she thanked him and let it be what it was. Dottie Farwell came. Mara noticed her arrival and was surprised by it. Dottie had come alone, without her husband, and she had the particular look of someone who had made a decision that cost something and was carrying the cost carefully. She didn't stay long. She found Mara near the table and said, with the compressed directness of someone who has rehearsed but is going off script, "I should have said something sooner. When Clara came out here, I shouldn't have come with her." She stopped. "I'm sorry." Mara looked at her. 23 years old, 2 children, a husband who voted with whoever was loudest, standing in someone else's yard on her wedding day with her sorry held out like something she hoped would be accepted. "You're here today," Mara said. Dottie nodded. Her chin was steady but barely. "That counts," Mara said, and meant it. Dottie went and ate a piece of cake and talked to Miss Aldrich for a while and left before noon, and Mara watched her go and thought about the particular courage it took to change direction in a small town where everyone was watching which way you faced. It was not a grand courage. It would not be remarked upon particularly, but it was real, and real was worth acknowledging. November came in cold and particular, the way it did in that country. Not gradually, but with a decisive shift, one week and then the next. The mountains went white at the peaks first, then lower. The fields the ranch had recovered through the fall settled into their winter quiet. The house settled too, around the new shape of things. It was not a seamless settling. Nothing real is seamless. There were mornings when Mara woke in the room that was now hers and his and had a disorienting few seconds of not knowing where she was, the way you do when your life has changed faster than your body has registered. There were evenings when she and Elias sat at the kitchen table and the silence between them was the wrong kind. The kind that comes from two people who have been alone a long time and haven't yet learned all of each other's silences. There were nights when she heard him at the window in the room and knew he was thinking about Sarah, and she said nothing because there was nothing to say about that except that it was true and she knew it, and it did not frighten her. She had not married a man without a past. She had married this specific man with this specific history, and the history was part of him, and she would not have him without it. Sarah Boone had made him the father Lena needed, had shaped the particular quality of his patience and his grief, and you could not remove those years without removing something essential. Mara understood this the way she understood most hard things. Not comfortably, but clearly. She kept a photograph of Sarah that she'd found in the sitting room, a small, formal portrait, the kind done at a traveling photographer's setup. Sarah sitting very straight with Lena as an infant on her lap, her expression serious in the manner of photograph subjects who had been told not to smile and had complied too literally. Mara had found it face down in a drawer, put there, she suspected, in the weeks after the funeral when Elias had been managing the sharpness of everything. She turned it right side up and put it on the shelf in the sitting room where Lena could see it. Lena stopped in front of it on a Tuesday and stood looking at it for a long moment. "You put that there," she said. "It was in a drawer," Mara said. "I know, Papa put it in the drawer." "I know he did." She sat down in the chair nearby. "I thought it should be where you can see it." Lena looked at the photograph. At her infant self on her mother's lap, round-faced and unknowing in the way of very young children. Then at her mother's serious, straight-backed posture. "She's pretty," Lena said. "She looks like you." Lena turned around at that, surprised. "She does?" "Around the eyes," Mara said, very serious, like she's thinking about something important. Lena looked back at the photograph with this new information, checking it. Then, "Can I take it to my room sometimes?" "It's yours," Mara said. "You can put it wherever you want." Lena picked it up carefully, held it in both hands. She looked at it a moment longer with the particular expression she had when she was deciding something, and then she walked over and sat on the arm of Mara's chair, an uninvited encroachment she had begun doing in the past few weeks with increasing confidence, and held the photograph so they could both see it. "Mama would have thought this was a good idea," she said. "You being here." Mara looked at the photograph. At this woman she had never met, this woman who had laughed at the wrong moments and known how to braid hair in 100 ways and told her daughter that hair remembers things, this woman who had made Elias the man who rode 6 miles in his good shirt to ask a widow to stay. "I hope so," she said. "I think so," Lena said, with the settled certainty of a child who has decided the matter is closed. They sat there together for a while, in the sitting room with the November light coming thin through the window, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to. Winter on the ranch was different from winter in town. In town, winter was something you endured between the closer walls of a small house on a street with neighbors who could be heard through the frost. Out here it was larger, more complete. The quiet of it, a genuine quiet, and not just the absence of particular noise. The mornings were dark long into what should have been morning, and the work of the ranch pulled earlier and pushed later, and the kitchen was the warmest room and the most inhabited. Mara baked through December the way she baked through everything, thoroughly, with attention, with the particular pleasure of hands that were always better when they were doing something. She kept her Tuesday market stall. The gap on each side had narrowed to 1 stall width by November, and by December it had closed. This was not a statement anyone made, it just happened. The way things happen in small towns when enough time passes and enough ordinary life accumulates around the difficult thing until the difficult thing is no longer the thing everyone is looking at. Clara Hennessy bought bread from her in November. She came to the stall and picked up a loaf and paid without meeting Mara's eyes directly. And Mara took the money and said good morning, and that was all of it. Not a reconciliation, not an apology, just a woman buying bread from a woman who made bread, which was the most ordinary transaction in the world. And its ordinariness was, in its own way, the resolution. She did not expect more from Clara Hennessy and was not disappointed. Some people change and some people just get tired of the effort of not changing, and both produce roughly similar behavior in public and in a small town. Public behavior was most of what you had to work with. By spring, the ranch had become something she could not have imagined on the morning she'd walked up the track with her basket, looking at the broken porch railing and the half-weeded garden and the shutter hanging at a wrong angle. Not because it had been transformed into something unrecognizable. It was still the same timber and stone house, still the same mountains at its back, still Pete appearing at the kitchen door every morning for his coffee and leaving in 4 words or fewer. But the feel of it had changed in the way that homes change when they are inhabited by people who have decided to stay. Elias expanded the north pasture in March, and the cattle prices held good into spring, and he paid off the fence repairs ahead of schedule, which he mentioned to her at the kitchen table with the contained pleasure of a man reporting something he'd been working toward for a long time. She told him that was good and meant it, and he looked at her across the table with that look she still found slightly unsettling and probably always would. And the ordinary evening went on. Lena turned 6 in April. They made a cake. Lena had specifications, which she delivered in the full detail of someone who had been thinking about this cake for approximately 3 months. It needed to be yellow. It needed to have this brown sugar frosting Mara had made once for a tart, and Lena had never forgotten. It needed to have, somehow, the cat on it, though the execution of this was a subject of some negotiation since Mara could bake and could not in any meaningful way draw a cat in frosting. It doesn't have to look exactly like him, Lena said. That's good, because it's going to look like a rectangle with ears. That's close enough. It was not close, objectively. The frosted patch on the top of Lena's birthday cake was an abstract rendering at best, a series of orange-tinted curves that gestured in the direction of cat without committing to any specifics. Lena looked at it and said, perfect, with such total conviction that Mara decided to accept the verdict. The Hendersons came for the birthday. Miss Aldrich came. Pete came in from this barn for it, which was the birthday gift Pete was constitutionally capable of giving, and he sat at the kitchen table and ate 2 pieces of cake and said good cake when it was over, which was his version of a standing ovation. Lena blew out her candles and Elias asked what she'd wished for, and Lena said, you weren't supposed to tell. And he said he'd make an exception. And Lena looked at him with the expression of someone who had heard this argument before and was unimpressed by it. I wish that Patch would stop knocking things off the shelf, she said. That's a wasted wish, Elias said. I know, Lena said sadly. I thought maybe. Patch, in his chair by the window, knocked a small tin off the shelf beside him with one deliberate paw, watched it fall, and looked away. There are things Mara understood by the following summer that she had not known when she walked into that ranch kitchen with her basket of flour and her brown sugar and her 2 vanilla beans. She had not known, for one thing, that belonging was something you built rather than something you found. She had spent 4 years in Red Hollow after Thomas died feeling like a misfit in a place that had once fit her, waiting, without quite knowing she was waiting, for the fit to come back, for the town to relent, or for herself to change, or for some arrangement of circumstances to produce the feeling of being in the right place. It had not occurred to her, in those 4 years, that she was waiting for the wrong thing, that belonging was not a fit you found or a welcome you were given. It was something you made, with work and attention and the willingness to stay past the point where staying was easy, until the thing you'd built around you was real enough to live in. She had also not known how much of her own fear she'd been carrying as a kind of identity. The widow. The woman the town looked through, the person who set up her table and kept her eyes down and endured. She had not known how much of that she'd accepted not because it was true, but because she'd stopped arguing with it. Because arguing took more than she'd had after Thomas. And it was easier to become the woman the town saw than to keep insisting she wasn't. What Lena had given her, without knowing she was giving anything, was a reason to argue again. Or not argue. She'd never been particularly interested in argument, but to refuse. To simply refuse the smaller version of herself that the town had constructed and keep being the actual size she was. She thought about this on a Tuesday in July, standing at her market stall. Her stall, which now had 2 neighboring stalls and 3 regular customers who came early before the good bread sold out, and watching Lena move through the market square with Elias, pointing at things, asking questions, being 6 in the complete and energetic way of someone who has remembered that the world is large and interesting and full of things that have not yet been examined. Lena spotted her across the square and waved with her whole arm, the full-body wave of small children who have not yet learned to make their gestures economical. Mara waved back. There was a woman nearby. Young, new to Red Hollow, she'd come in with a husband who was setting up a forge at the south end of town, who had been looking at Mara's bread with the tentative manner of someone who didn't yet know the landscape of the market, who was still learning which stalls were which and who ran them. "These are good?" she asked, pointing at the rye. "The best in Red Hollow," said a voice behind her. She turned. Margaret Pruitt, of all people, who had not been to Mara's stall since the fall, who had been Clara Hennessy's second, who had stood in the yard that morning with her chin up and her opinion sharpened, was standing there with her own basket, looking at the bread. Margaret looked at Mara. There was something working in her face that was complicated and not entirely resolved. "They are," she said, shorter now, with less of the performance. "Good bread." The young woman bought a loaf. Margaret bought one too, not looking at Mara directly, but also not looking away. "Thank you," Mara said, to both of them. Margaret nodded, moved on. Mara watched her go and thought about what it was worth. Not nothing and not everything, which is where most honest assessments of human behavior landed. Margaret Pruitt had not transformed. She had just today bought bread. Tomorrow she would be whoever she was tomorrow, and that might be different, or it might not. The question of what people were worth was rarely a fixed thing. What was fixed, what Mara had come to understand as fixed, in the way that a few true things are fixed, was this. She could not control what the town thought of her. She had never been able to. She had spent years trying to make herself small enough, quiet enough, adequate enough to earn the town's ordinary regard. And it had not worked, because that was not how regard was earned. Regard, like belonging, was not given. It was either irrelevant or it was built slowly, through the accumulation of actual things. Bread that was genuinely good, presence that was genuinely there, work that was genuinely done. She had built something. She hadn't been trying to build it. She'd been trying to keep a child alive, and the building had happened around that. The way things grow when you give them what they need and then stop thinking about them so much. The summer afternoon when she understood she was happy was unremarkable in every way. She was in the kitchen garden. She had expanded it in spring, new beds along the east fence, the kind of long-term project that assumed you were going to be here to see them through, which was its own kind of declaration. She was on her knees in the second row, which was where she'd been on the morning Elias rode up to her town garden gate, and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon, and the mountains were doing what they always did in this light, which was to look like they had been put there specifically for that hour. She could hear, through the open kitchen window, the sounds of Lena inside. Some conversation with Patch that was going one-sided, as conversations with Patch always did. The sound of something being moved on a shelf. The small, domestic sounds of a child in a kitchen who is comfortable in it, who is at home. She could hear, further off, the sound of Elias coming back from the fields, the horse on the track, then the yard, the particular sound of his dismount that she had learned without learning it. She kept her hands in the dirt. She thought about the morning she'd left, the dark track, the gate closing behind her, the deliberate thought, this is the right thing. She thought about how certain she'd been, how completely wrong. Not wrong that she was afraid, but she had been afraid and the fear was real, but wrong that the fear was the important thing, that the fear was the thing that should determine what she did. Fear told you something was significant. It did not tell you to retreat from it. That was the lesson she'd spent a year learning and was not sure she would have learned any other way. Some lessons arrive through the door and you recognize them. Some lessons you have to make a mistake to get. She had made the mistake and gotten the lesson, which seemed, in the end, like a reasonable trade. Elias came through the garden gate. He had that particular end-of-day look, the work still on him, the dirt on his hands, the tiredness that was different from suffering, the way he moved when he'd done the thing that needed doing and was ready to be somewhere else. He looked at her on her knees in the second row and said nothing for a moment. "Dinner soon," he said. 20 minutes. He crouched down next to her, not helping. He didn't know the garden the way she did, and he knew he didn't, and looked at what she was doing with the mild, genuine attention of someone who was interested in things without needing to be the one doing them. "The tomatoes are going to come in heavy," she said. "More preserving. More preserving." She sat back on her heels. "You could help with that." "I could," he said, in the tone of a man who was not going to help with that. She pressed her lips together. "Pete?" Pete would rather be shot. "Lena. Lena will help with anything if there's something to taste at the end." He looked at the garden, at the rows, the stakes, the string. "You've done good work here." It was a simple thing to say. He meant it simply. She took it simply, not as a compliment about the garden specifically, but as what it was, which was a man noting with genuine attention the things built by the people near him. "It helps when you like the place," she said. He looked at her sideways. "Do you? Still?" She thought about the question, about Red Hollow with its Gap in the market stalls that had closed, and its Clara Hennessy who had bought bread in November, and its Dottie Farwell who had come to the wedding carrying her sari carefully in both hands, about the ranch with its mountains and its Pete and its large opinionated orange cat, about the kitchen that smelled like bread in the mornings and the evenings at the table, and the particular quality of a life that was not the one she'd expected to be living and had turned out to be exactly the one she wanted. "Yes," she said. He nodded, got back to his feet. His knees were worse than hers, which she had told him was because he never wore the right protection for them, which he ignored, which was a conversation they had approximately once a month and would probably have until one of them gave up. 20 minutes, he said. 20 minutes, she agreed. He went inside. She turned back to the row. The light was still doing what it did. The mountains were still where they were. Somewhere in the kitchen, Patch knocked something off the shelf. She heard the small clatter of it. And Lena said, "Patch!" in the exact tone of someone who was not actually upset, who was in fact delighted by the predictability of a cat who knocked things over, who had decided that a life with an unpredictable orange animal and a father who understood her and a woman who knew how to make butter cookies and meant it when she said she was going to stay. She had decided that this was a life worth wanting. Mara knew this because Lena had told her. Not in a speech, not in a declaration, in the small, specific ways children tell you things. In the way she reached for Mara's hand in the market and didn't think about it. In the way she asked one morning if she could call her something other than Mara, and then decided against it because she liked Mara. It suited her. She wasn't going to change it just because other people had different arrangements. In the way she ate her dinner every night with the thoroughness of someone who intended to be there in the morning. She was going to be there in the morning. They all were. That was the thing Mara had not known to hope for when she'd arrived with her basket and her brown sugar and her particular stubbornness. She had not known that what she was walking toward was a morning. Not a resolution, not a fixed thing, not an ending. Just the next morning and the one after, and all the ordinary, imperfect, real mornings that made up a life. Each one small enough to hold and large enough to matter. She had been told, for most of her adult life, that she was too much and not enough in various configurations. Too wide, too quiet, too plain, too stubborn, too ready to kneel in the dust of a market square in her good skirt without regard for what it looked like. She had accepted some of these verdicts at various points because accepting them was easier than arguing, and she had been tired. She was not tired now. She was on her knees in the dirt in the late afternoon light, with her husband inside and her daughter talking to a cat, and the tomatoes coming in heavy, and 20 minutes until dinner, and she was exactly the size she had always been, which turned out, after everything, to be exactly right. The world does not always offer this. Most lives do not get a clear moment when the thing you feared most, being found insufficient, being left, being the woman everyone looked through, turns out to have been the wrong fear all along. Most people work it out slowly, over decades, without the clarifying pressure of a child's life in the balance and a town's judgment arrayed against them, and one specific morning when they had to decide whether the fear was going to win or they were. Mara had gotten that morning. She'd gotten it, and she'd gotten it wrong the first time, which was human and therefore not something she intended to spend much more time being hard on herself about. She had gotten up. She had come back. She had stayed. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. She pulled the last of the weeds from the second row, got to her feet, brushed the dirt from her hands. The light had gone that perfect bronze now, the last of the afternoon, the mountains clean and enormous at the edge of the world. She picked up her basket and went inside to make dinner.